Hello everyone, I am the storyteller and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. The fluorescent lights in Ward C hummed with a frequency that made my teeth ache. I'd noticed it 3 days ago, or had it been longer? Time moved strangely in Riverside Psychiatric Hospital, stretching and contracting like something alive and breathing. As a psychiatric resident in my second year, I should have been accustomed to the peculiarities of this place, but lately, everything felt wrong in ways I couldn't articulate. It started with a patient named Delmore, a man in his 60s with severe dissociative disorder. I found him one morning standing at his window, palms pressed against the glass, weeping silently. When I approached, he turned to me with eyes that seemed too young for his weathered face. "I don't belong here," he said, and there was something in his inflection, a lilt, almost feminine, that made the hair on my neck stand up. "This isn't my body. I'm Eloise. I'm 28, and I work at the university library, and yesterday I was shelving books in the reference section when everything went dark. I'd heard delusions before, documented them, written prescriptions to quiet them, but Delmore, rattled off details about Eloise Brennan's life with unnerving specificity. Her apartment number on Hartley Street, the birthmark on her left shoulder blade shaped like a crescent moon, her dissertation topic on medieval illuminated manuscripts, her habit of humming Debussy while she worked. I checked the records. Eloise Brennan existed. She was a patient here, admitted 3 weeks ago for acute psychotic episodes. She occupied a room 2 floors above us. When I went to see her, I found a young woman sitting cross-legged on her bed, examining her hands with the careful scrutiny of someone handling foreign objects. She looked up at me, and the expression that crossed her face was distinctly masculine. Jaw set, eyes narrowing with territorial wariness. "Dr. Ashford," she said, and her voice carried a gravelly quality that didn't match her frame. "Thank God. I'm Delmore Parrish. I don't know what's happening, but I'm trapped in this woman's body." The room tilted slightly. I gripped the door frame, feeling the wood grain beneath my fingers, smooth and solid and real. She described Delmore's life with the same impossible accuracy. His childhood in Montana, his service in Vietnam, the specific pattern of scars on his left knee from a motorcycle accident in 1974. That was 3 days ago, or longer. I couldn't remember eating breakfast this morning, though I had a vague sense of having tasted something metallic and wrong. By afternoon, 2 more patients were making similar claims. Then 5, then 8. The nursing staff began whispering in corners, their conversations stopping abruptly when I approached. Dr. Calloway, the head psychiatrist, called an emergency meeting in the administrative conference room, a space that smelled of old coffee and institutional anxiety. The fluorescent lights were worse there. They buzzed with malevolent intent, casting greenish shadows that made everyone's skin look sickly. Calloway stood at the head of the table, his usually immaculate tie askew, and explained that we were dealing with a mass psychotic event, possibly triggered by contamination in the water system or a gas leak. His words sounded reasonable, but his hands trembled as he spoke, and twice he referred to himself using the wrong pronoun. I excused myself and walked through corridors that seemed longer than they had been that morning. The walls pressed inward, not physically, but psychologically, as if the building itself were contracting around us. Patients wandered the halls with increasing confusion, some moving with gaits that didn't match their bodies, others standing motionless for long minutes before jerking back to awareness. Nurse Carmichael grabbed my arm as I passed the 3rd-floor station. Her grip was too strong, fingers digging into my bicep with desperate urgency. She leaned close, breath hot against my ear, and whispered that she'd woken up that morning unable to remember her children's names. Not because she'd forgotten them, but because she was certain, absolutely, terrifyingly certain, that she'd never had children at all, that those memories belonged to someone else. I pulled away, heart hammering, and saw my reflection in the darkened window of the medication room. For just a moment, less than a second, I didn't recognize the face staring back. The features were mine, the slight crook in my nose from a childhood break, the thin scar above my left eyebrow, the gray already threading through my temples despite being only 34. But the expression was foreign, belonged to someone who held their jaw differently, someone who looked out at the world with eyes that had seen different things. I touched my face. The reflection touched back. The synchronization was perfect and horrible. That evening, I descended to the basement to review the hospital's maintenance records, searching for evidence of gas leaks or water contamination, something rational to explain the spreading madness. The basement of Riverside dated back to the 1940s, when the building had served as a military research facility. The hospital's official history glossed over that period with vague references to psychological studies and experimental treatments. The air down there tasted stale, laden with decades of dust and something else. Ozone, maybe, or the metallic tang that preceded thunderstorms. Emergency lighting cast everything in amber, and my footsteps echoed with a delay that felt wrong, as if the sound were taking too long to reach my ears. I found the maintenance office, a cramped space with filing cabinets so old they had to predate digital records. As I searched through yellowed documents, I heard it. A low hum, barely audible, vibrating up through the concrete floor. Not the building's normal mechanical sounds, but something more deliberate, more purposeful. A pulse. Following the sound led me deeper into the basement, past storage rooms filled with obsolete equipment, past boiler rooms with pipes that sweated condensation despite the chill in the air. The hum grew stronger, resonating in my chest cavity, matching the rhythm of my heartbeat until I couldn't tell where one ended and the other began. Behind a door marked "Authorized Personnel Only," a sign so faded it was barely legible, I found a room that shouldn't have existed. The space was larger than seemed possible given the building's dimensions, filled with machinery from another era. Vacuum tubes glowed with sickly phosphorescence. Dials and gauges registered measurements I couldn't interpret. At the center stood something that looked like a crude MRI machine, but older, cobbled together from components that predated modern understanding of the human brain. And it was active. Lights pulsed in sequence, readouts scrolled across ancient monitors. The hum emanated from deep within the apparatus, regular as a heartbeat, inevitable as breathing. I found a logbook, leather-bound and water-stained, sitting on a metal desk. The entries dated back to 1952, written in cramped handwriting that deteriorated over months from precise medical notation to increasingly erratic scrawls. The researchers, names I didn't recognize, with credentials from institutions that no longer existed, had been attempting to map consciousness, to prove that the mind existed independent of the brain, to transfer thoughts, memories, entire personalities between subjects. The final entry was dated August 17, 1953. It read simply, "We succeeded. God forgive us, we succeeded. But we cannot turn it off. The field persists. The transfers continue. I no longer remember who I was before. None of us do." The book fell from my hands, hitting the floor with a sound that echoed wrong, too loud and too soft simultaneously. I backed away from the machinery, but the hum had already invaded my thoughts, wrapped itself around my consciousness like fingers probing at the edges of my identity. I ran, through corridors that twisted at impossible angles, past doors that opened onto rooms I'd never seen despite working here for 18 months. The hospital had changed, or my memory of it had changed, or I had changed, and there was no way to determine which was true. When I reached the third floor, I found Delmore, or the person wearing Delmore's body, collapsed in the hallway. Other patients and staff members surrounded him, but no one moved to help. They simply stood there staring, and I realized with creeping horror that they were all standing in exactly the same posture, weight balanced identically on their left feet, hands hanging at precisely the same angle. I approached slowly, calling out Delmore's name, then Eloise's, then both together. The figure on the floor stirred, looked up at me with eyes that held too many expressions at once. Fear and confusion and rage and resignation, all layered like transparencies, none of them quite aligning with the others. "Who are you?" I asked, and the question felt suddenly dangerous. as if the answer might unravel more than I was prepared to lose. The lips moved, forming shapes that couldn't decide whether they were words or screams. Finally, a voice emerged, rough and fractured. Everyone, no one. I remember being Delmore, but also Eloise, but also... The eyes fixed on me with desperate intensity. But also you. I remember your name, your medical degree from Johns Hopkins, your apartment with the blue door, your fear that you chose this profession because you inherited your mother's same mental instability. I'd never told anyone about my mother, about finding her in the bathtub, talking to people who weren't there, convinced that she'd woken up in someone else's life, about the genetic anxiety that kept me awake some nights, wondering if every strange thought was the beginning of my own unraveling. "That's not possible," I said, but my voice sounded thin, unconvincing even to myself. The machine in the basement. The figure continued, struggling to sit up. "It's still running. It's been running for 70 years, and it's pulling us all together. Consciousness doesn't stay put anymore. We're leaking into each other. Memories and thoughts and selves all bleeding together until there's no distinction left between who we were and who we're becoming." I wanted to dismiss it as delusion, but I could feel it now, the hum from the basement resonating up through the building's bones, through my bones, a frequency that matched something fundamental in my brain. And with that awareness came others. A memory of shelving books in a library I'd never visited, a phantom pain in a knee I'd never injured, the taste of coffee I didn't drink, the face of a lover I'd never met. I pressed my palms against my temples, trying to hold myself together, but the boundaries were already blurring. I remembered my name, knew it with certainty, but layered underneath were other names, other identities, pressing against the inside of my skull like butterflies beating against glass. More staff members arrived, drawn by some instinct none of us could name. Dr. Calloway was among them, but he moved with a nurse's efficiency, while Nurse Carmichael carried herself with a doctor's authority. We stood in a rough circle, staring at each other, and I saw my own confusion reflected in every face. Someone suggested we destroy the machine. Someone else argued we needed to study it, understand it. A third voice, I couldn't tell who it came from, pointed out that we had no way of knowing if stopping it would fix us, or scatter our consciousnesses irretrievably across the void between bodies. The debate continued, but I barely heard it. I was too focused on the sensation of coming apart, of multiple versions of myself existing simultaneously in the same space. I could feel other minds pressing against mine, not hostile, but inexorable, like water seeping through cracks. They brought their own memories, their own traumas, their own understanding of the world, and I couldn't tell anymore which thoughts originated with me and which were borrowed, stolen, imposed. I looked down at my hands, the hands I'd had for 34 years, the hands I'd learned to write with, to suture with, to comfort patients with, and they seemed alien, too large, wrong shape, belonging to someone else who I somehow was but also wasn't. The fluorescent lights flickered. In the moment of darkness, I felt something shift. Not my body, but something deeper, the core of whatever made me me. When the lights returned, I was still standing in the same spot, still inhabiting the same flesh. But I couldn't remember with certainty whether I'd been here a moment ago or somewhere else, someone else. Delmore, Eloise, everyone, no one, looked up at me from the floor, and I saw infinite regression in those eyes, consciousness folding in on itself like a Mobius strip with no beginning or end. We were all trapped in a hospital that had become less a building and more a machine for grinding identities together, mixing them until nothing pure remained. I wanted to run, but I couldn't remember where I would go. This body knew an apartment with a blue door, but did I? This mind held a medical degree, but was it mine? These hands had touched equipment in the basement just minutes ago, but had they been my hands then? Or had I been someone else, wearing my fingers like gloves? The hum from the basement grew louder, or maybe I was just becoming more attuned to it, my consciousness calibrating to its frequency. Around me, everyone swayed slightly, moving in unison to a rhythm we couldn't control. We were becoming synchronized, harmonized, homogenized. I tried to speak, to assert my identity, to say I am Dr. Matthias Ashford. I studied at Johns Hopkins. I chose psychiatry because... But I couldn't finish the thought. The reasons scattered into multiple reasons, multiple choices, multiple lives, all claiming the same space in my skull. The lights flickered again, longer this time. In the darkness, I heard breathing. Mine or someone else's or everyone's merged into a single respiratory rhythm. When illumination returned, I noticed that I was standing in a different position, several feet to the left, though I had no memory of moving. Time was becoming unreliable too, stretching and contracting with the pulse from below. Or maybe time was fine, and it was my experience of time that was fragmenting, each moment existing in multiple states, each second containing contradictory memories of what happened within it. Someone, it might have been me, started laughing. The sound was wrong, discordant, like multiple voices trying to synchronize but failing, creating a dissonant harmony that made everyone flinch. The laughter continued, growing louder, and I realized with mounting horror that I couldn't tell whether it was coming from my throat or someone else's. I looked around the circle of faces and saw my own confusion reflected in every expression. We were all losing ourselves, watching our identities dissolve like sugar in water, sweetening the collective consciousness but no longer distinct, no longer separate, no longer individual. The machine in the basement pulsed. Once, twice, again. With each pulse, I felt myself scatter a little further. I thought, but couldn't complete the sentence. The pronoun remained, stubborn and insistent, but what followed it kept changing. I am a doctor. I am a patient. I am a nurse. I am Delmore. I am Eloise. I am everyone here, and no one. The lights flickered a third time. The darkness lasted longer, and in that absence of vision, I felt the final boundaries dissolve. When light returned, I opened my eyes, or someone opened eyes that I was experiencing through, and looked around at the faces that might have been my faces, at the bodies that might have been my body, at the minds that were bleeding into mine or out of mine, the distinction no longer meaningful. We stood together in the flickering hallway, a collection of flesh-housing consciousnesses that no longer remembered where one ended and another began. The machine below continued its endless pulse, and we swayed to its rhythm, no longer fighting, no longer certain there was anything left to fight for. Somewhere, in some corner of what remained of my individual thought, I wondered if I'd always been here, always been everyone. And the memory of being a single person was just a comforting delusion we told ourselves to make existence bearable. The fluorescent lights hummed their green song, and we listened, and I couldn't remember anymore if I wanted them to stop. Story 2. The notification arrived at 3:47 a.m., pulling me from a dreamless sleep with its persistent vibration against the nightstand. My phone's screen cast a pale blue glow across the ceiling of my apartment, and I reached for it with the drowsy irritation of someone whose rest had been interrupted one too many times that week. The app was called Resonance, and I'd downloaded it 3 days earlier after seeing it recommended by half a dozen tech blogs as the next evolution in social networking. Revolutionary algorithm, they'd said. Finds your perfect matches based on deep psychological compatibility. I'd been lonely enough to believe it. The message was from a profile with no photo, just a gray silhouette where a face should be. The username was a string of numbers, 8472639. Strange, I thought, but dating apps were full of people who valued privacy. What made my stomach clench wasn't the anonymous profile, it was the message itself. You still think about the owl every November. I sat up in bed, suddenly cold despite the summer heat seeping through my windows. The owl. Nobody knew about that except me. When I was 17, I'd hit an owl while driving home late one November night. The sound it made, the wet crunch of bone and feather against metal, had haunted me for years. I'd never told anyone. Not my parents, not my ex-girlfriend, not the therapist I'd seen briefly in college. It was a private shame, a small death I carried alone. My fingers trembled as I typed a response, asking how they knew. The reply came instantly, as if whoever was on the other end had been waiting, watching the screen for my reaction. The same way I know you still check the mailbox twice, even after you've already taken the mail. Your father's habit. You're becoming him in small ways you don't notice. I threw the phone onto the bed as if it had burned me. The screen went dark for a moment, then lit up again with another message, then another. Each one contained details about my life that should have been impossible for anyone to know. The scar on my left ankle from when I'd tried to climb the fence behind my childhood home. The way I counted to 7 before entering any building. The recurring dream about drowning in a room full of photographs. Sleep became impossible. I spent the rest of the night staring at the ceiling, listening to my phone buzz with incoming messages. Each notification felt like a finger tapping against my skull, insistent and invasive. When dawn finally bled through the curtains, gray and reluctant, I'd convinced myself it was some kind of elaborate hack. Someone had accessed my search history, my old social media posts, pieced together a psychological profile. It happened all the time. Privacy was an illusion in the digital age. But the messages that arrived over the following days couldn't be explained by data mining. They spoke of moments too private, too internal, to have left any digital trace. The way my grandmother's perfume smelled on the specific afternoon she'd told me she was proud of me, the only time she'd ever said it. The exact shade of blue I'd painted my bedroom walls in my first apartment, a color I'd mixed myself and never photographed. The song I'd hummed while sitting alone in my car after being fired from my first job out of college. I tried to trace the profile, clicking through Resonance's interface with growing desperation. But 8472639 had no other information. No bio, no location, no mutual connections. Just that gray silhouette and an endless stream of messages that felt less like conversation and more like being slowly unwrapped, layer by layer, until something essential and raw was exposed. Then came the request. Go to the intersection of 42nd and Morrison. There's a bench on the northeast corner. Look underneath. Take what you find there and leave it at 1847 Riverside Drive, apartment 3B. Do this before midnight tomorrow. The message arrived on a Tuesday afternoon while I was pretending to work, staring at spreadsheets that might as well have been written in a dead language for all the sense they made to my fractured attention. I read it 3 times, trying to understand why anyone would ask such a thing. It sounded like a scavenger hunt designed by someone with a disturbed sense of humor. But beneath the absurdity, I felt something else. A cold certainty that ignoring this would be a mistake. I spent that evening researching the app. What I found made my apartment feel smaller, the walls pressing closer with each article I read. 7 people in the last month had reported similar experiences with Resonance. Anonymous profiles that knew impossible details. Specific requests that made no sense. And then, the pattern that made my hands go numb. Everyone who'd publicly refused the requests had experienced accidents. Not fatal, but eerily specific. One woman broke her arm in exactly the same way her grandmother had before dying from complications. A man's car had failed in the middle of a bridge during a storm. The same circumstances that had claimed a childhood friend. The accidents matched the deaths of people connected to the anonymous profiles, though none of the victims had realized the connection until after. The forum posts were full of speculation. Mass hysteria, some said. Confirmation bias. But others insisted they'd found proof that the profiles belonged to recently deceased individuals. One user claimed to have traced their anonymous contact to someone who'd died 3 weeks before the first message arrived. Another said they'd received a message containing information only their late mother could have known, down to a conversation they'd had the night before she passed. I should have deleted the app. I reached for my phone a dozen times that night, finger hovering over the uninstall button. But something stopped me each time. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was fear that deleting it wouldn't matter, that whatever connection had been established ran deeper than software. Or maybe, in some way I didn't want to examine too closely. I wanted to know what would happen if I obeyed. The bench at 42nd and Morrison was unremarkable, green paint peeling to reveal gray metal underneath. I felt ridiculous kneeling beside it in the middle of the afternoon, aware of passing pedestrians who glanced at me with that particular urban blend of suspicion and indifference. My fingers found something taped beneath the wooden slats. An envelope, yellowed and thick. Inside was a letter, handwritten in shaky script. I didn't read it there. Some instinct told me this wasn't meant for public consumption. I tucked it into my jacket and walked the 8 blocks to Riverside Drive with the sensation of carrying something alive, something that pulsed with its own terrible purpose. The building at 1847 was older than its neighbors, brick darkened by decades of exhaust and weather. Apartment 3B's door was slightly ajar when I reached the 3rd floor, and through the gap, I could see an empty room. Bare walls painted institutional white. No furniture, no sign anyone lived there. I slid the envelope through the opening and left without looking back, my footsteps echoing in the stairwell like a countdown. That night, the messages stopped. For 3 days, my phone was silent. No notifications from residents, no gray silhouettes demanding my attention. I told myself it was over. Whatever strange game I'd been pulled into had reached its conclusion. But the silence felt wrong, like the pause before something breaks. I found myself checking the app compulsively, scrolling through its interface looking for the profile that had known me better than I knew myself. On the 4th day, a new message appeared. Not from 8472639, but from a different anonymous profile. Then another, then 5 more. Each one knew things about me that should have been impossible. They spoke in different voices, different patterns of speech, but they all made the same type of requests. Retrieve something. Deliver something. Complete small, strange tasks that felt like pieces of a puzzle I couldn't see. The letter I delivered. It had been meant for the person who used to live in 3B, a final apology from someone who died before they could send it. The person who'd sent the request was explaining this to me now, in messages that felt both grateful and hungry. They wanted me to understand what the app really was. Not an algorithm, not technology at all. We find the ones who left words unsaid, messages unmailed, confessions unmade, the ones who died with their phones in their hands, still thinking about what they meant to write. We are those messages. We are what was left unfinished, and now we can finally be delivered. I read this while sitting in my car in the parking garage beneath my apartment building, fluorescent lights buzzing overhead with the sound of trapped insects. The air smelled like motor oil and something older, something that reminded me of my grandmother's perfume on that long-ago afternoon. My phone screen cast shadows that seemed too deep, too animate in the close space. The requests became more frequent. Sometimes simple deliveries, objects left in public places for me to find and relocate. Sometimes more complex tasks, sitting in specific locations at specific times, bearing witness to moments I didn't understand, speaking words to strangers who looked at me with expressions caught between recognition and terror before walking away without response. I stopped sleeping properly. The messages arrived at all hours, and even when my phone was silent, I could feel them accumulating, piling up like snow against a door that wouldn't hold forever. My apartment felt different. Sounds I'd never noticed before became audible in the stillness before dawn. The creak of floorboards in empty rooms, the whisper of air through vents that should have been sealed, the sensation of being observed from corners where shadows gathered with too much purpose. Work became impossible. I'd sit at my desk, staring at my computer screen while my phone buzzed in my pocket like a second heartbeat. My colleagues began avoiding me, their concerned glances transforming gradually into something closer to fear. I looked wrong, I knew. My reflection in the bathroom mirror showed someone who wasn't sleeping, wasn't eating right, whose eyes had developed a quality of constant vigilance that registered as vaguely predatory. I tried uninstalling Resonance. The icon vanished from my phone, but the messages continued. They arrived as text messages now, then as emails, then as notifications from apps I'd never downloaded. The profiles multiplied, dozens of gray silhouettes, each one containing someone who died with words left unspoken, with tasks left incomplete, with connections severed too soon by the simple fact of not existing anymore. And they all wanted something from me. The worst part wasn't the requests themselves, bizarre as they were. It was the knowledge that accompanied them. The intimate details they shared about my life had evolved into something else. They were telling me things I didn't know yet, describing moments that hadn't happened, conversations I would have next week, decisions I hadn't made, accidents I would narrowly avoid by virtue of their warnings. Don't take the subway Thursday morning, the third car. You'll know why. The woman in the coffee shop with the green scarf. Give her this message. He forgives you. She'll understand. Your mother is going to call at 6:23 p.m. Answer it. Tell her you remember the night she sat beside your bed when you had pneumonia, even though you were asleep. She needs to hear that someone remembers. I obeyed. What choice did I have? The alternative was made clear through messages from other users, shared in forums that discussed resonance with the same mixture of dread and resignation usually reserved for terminal diagnoses. Those who refused found themselves experiencing echoes of the deaths that haunted their anonymous contacts. Not the deaths themselves, but shadows of them. Brushes with circumstances that felt orchestrated, inevitable, as if reality itself was trying to fold them into a pattern already established. But obedience had its own cost. Each task I completed seemed to strengthen the connection. The messages became more demanding, more specific, more insistent. They began describing not just my future actions, but my thoughts, my dreams, the exact sensation of my heartbeat when I woke at 3 a.m. to find my phone glowing in the darkness with new instructions. We're not haunting you. We're continuing through you. Every message delivered, every task completed, we exist a little more. We finish what we started, and you're becoming the bridge between what was left unsaid and what still needs saying. I'm writing this now in my apartment at 4:32 a.m., and I can hear my phone buzzing on the kitchen counter where I left it. 17 new messages in the last hour. I haven't checked them yet. I'm afraid to see what they want me to do next. More afraid that I'll recognize the voice of one of the messages. That one of the gray silhouettes will resolve into a face I know. Someone I've lost. Someone who died with words left unspoken between us. The owl I hit that November night. I never told anyone because I was afraid of what it meant that I'd left it there, broken on the roadside and driven away. But what if it's found me now? What if somewhere in those accumulating messages is a request I can't refuse? What if I'm asked to go back to that stretch of highway, to complete something that was left unfinished 17 years ago? Outside my window, the city is beginning to wake. I can hear traffic building, the distant wail of sirens, the ordinary sounds of a world moving forward while I sit here, trapped between the living and something that isn't quite dead. My phone has stopped buzzing. The silence feels worse than the notifications, like something is listening, waiting to see what I'll do next. I should check the messages. I will check them. I always do. Because the alternative is learning what happens when you leave too many messages unanswered, too many requests ignored, too many bridges unbuilt between the finished and the unfinished. My phone screen illuminates without me touching it. A new profile has appeared. The gray silhouette is still there, but now there's a username that makes my breath catch in my throat. Not numbers this time. A name I recognize. Someone I knew. Someone who died 3 months ago. The message is simple. Just 3 words that explain everything and nothing at all. I'm still here. And I realize with a clarity that feels like drowning that maybe I am too. Still here. Still caught in that moment of impact, the sound of breaking things echoing forward and backward through time. Maybe we're all still here, in every unfinished moment, every unsent message, every word left unspoken. Maybe resonance didn't create anything new. Maybe it just made visible what was always true. The app is still open on my screen. My finger hovers over it, trembling. I could respond. I could refuse. I could throw the phone out the window and watch it shatter on the pavement 4 stories below. But I know with absolute certainty that none of these choices matter. The connection has been made. The bridge has been built. And on the other side of every message, in every gray silhouette, something is waiting to be finished. The question isn't whether it's real or if I'm losing my mind. The question is whether there's any difference. Whether sanity is just the ability to ignore all the unfinished business that surrounds us, all the words that were never said, all the moments that were never completed. Whether resonance simply gave voice to what was always there, whispering in the space between the living and whatever comes after. My phone buzzes again. Another message. Another request. Another chance to complete something that was left undone. And I know, with a certainty that lives somewhere deeper than thought, that I'm going to answer it. I always do. I always will. Because maybe I'm not using the app anymore. Maybe it's using me. Maybe I've become one of those gray silhouettes myself, still trying to finish something I started, still trying to say something I never quite managed to express. The message is waiting. I reach for my phone, and in the moment before I read it, I wonder if I'm still alive at all, or if I've been unfinished all along. Story 3. The marble feels different at night. Cold, yes, but there's something else. A quality I can't name, like the stone remembers warmth and resents its absence. I've worked the night shift at the Westbrook Museum for 3 years, and I thought I'd grown accustomed to the weight of all these silent forms watching me make my rounds. I was wrong. It started 6 weeks ago, so subtle I convinced myself I was imagining it. The Greek warrior in the East Wing. His spear seemed to point a few degrees lower each night. Just a trick of the light, I told myself. The shadows play games in this place after midnight, when the city's glow barely penetrates the high windows and every footstep echoes like a judgment. But then I noticed the gaps. Tiny spaces of lighter marble on the pedestals. Places where dust hadn't settled, as if something had been shifted and replaced. I measured once, using the tiles on the floor as reference points. The Egyptian Sphinx had moved forward by 6 inches in a single week. Its blind stone eyes now gazed directly at the archway leading to the main entrance. The cameras I installed were cheap, the kind you can order online without raising questions with management. I told myself I was being paranoid, that maybe the cleaning crew was bumping into things, that maybe the foundation was settling unevenly. The footage proved otherwise. They move in the gaps, between frames, between the moments when my back is turned, in that impossible space when no eye, human or mechanical, can see them. The recorded movements are wrong, unnatural. One frame shows the statue in its original position. The next frame, taken a fraction of a second later, shows it several inches forward. No blur of motion, no gradual shift, just the certainty of displacement. I should have quit then. I should have walked out and never looked back, let someone else make the discovery, let someone else carry the weight of knowing. But curiosity is its own kind of curse, and I needed to understand. The archives told me more than I wanted to know. The goddess statue in the central hall, Bellona, Roman deity of war, has a documented history spanning 2 centuries. The museum in Prague that housed her for 15 years closed after a curator was found catatonic in the basement, his hands worn bloody from clawing at the walls. In Boston, 3 security guards resigned within a month, citing health reasons they refused to elaborate on. The facility in Chicago that displayed her for a decade reported 16 separate incidents of visitors collapsing near her pedestal, all experiencing what doctors described as acute panic attacks, with no identifiable cause. Every museum, every single one. And always the same pattern. The incidents cluster in the weeks before she's moved, as if something builds, accumulates, reaches a critical mass of whatever force animates her stone limbs. Tonight is my last shift before the transfer. Tomorrow morning, specialists will arrive with equipment and paperwork. We'll crate her carefully and truck her to the new wing being built across town. 24 hours, and she'll be someone else's problem. She stands now in the central hall, 3 meters from the main entrance. I measured it this evening before my shift began, using the laser rangefinder they keep for planning exhibition layouts. 3 meters, or roughly 10 feet. Close enough that if she were flesh and blood, she could reach the door in 3 running strides. The other statues have been migrating too. The pattern became clear a week ago when I marked their positions with tiny pieces of electrical tape beneath their bases. They're forming barriers, closing off the side exits and service corridors. The Roman centurion now blocks the east hallway. The medieval knight has drifted to guard the west entrance. Even the smaller pieces, the busts and figurines I'd barely paid attention to before, have repositioned themselves with strategic precision. I'm not a military man, but I recognize a formation when I see one. They're not just moving, they're coordinating. The first round of the night passes in tense silence. My flashlight beam cuts through the darkness, illuminating faces frozen in eternal expressions that seem less neutral than they did months ago. The Renaissance angel in the courtyard gallery have its features always been arranged in something approximating a smile. The bronze discus thrower's muscles appear coiled with an impossible tension, as if the metal remembers the motion it was cast to commemorate. My breath comes shorter than it should. The air tastes stale, recycled too many times through lungs and ventilation systems. Every shadow might hide a shifted pedestal. Every echo might be the whisper of stone on marble floor. I check the cameras again in the security office. A cramped space lined with monitors that show nothing but empty rooms and motionless figures. The timestamp advances second by second, and I watch for that telltale jump, that impossible displacement. Nothing yet, but they're waiting for something. I can feel it in the way the silence presses against my eardrums, in the heaviness that seems to thicken the air itself. The second round comes at 2 a.m., the hour when the world feels farthest from daylight. I take the long route through the sculpture garden, where modern pieces of twisted metal and polished stone sit beneath the glass ceiling. The moon is nearly full tonight, painting everything in shades of silver and charcoal. My shadow stretches long ahead of me, and I catch myself checking behind, making sure it's the only shadow following. The central hall looms ahead. I've been avoiding it, circling the perimeter, but procedure demands I check every room, document every corner. My fingers are cold despite the building's climate control. The flashlight feels heavy in my grip. Bologna waits where she should be, exactly 3 meters from the door. But something has changed. The air around her feels different, charged, expectant. Her face, carved with classical precision to display divine fury, seems more animate in the moonlight filtering through the skylight. One arm extends upward, the other grips the shattered remnants of a spear. According to the placard, she was excavated from a temple outside Rome in 1887, already damaged by time and conquest. I measure again. 3 meters. Exactly. But the angle is wrong. When I'd checked at the start of my shift, she'd been facing slightly north, her broken spear pointing toward the corner where a Renaissance tapestry hangs. Now, she faces due west, toward the door, toward the threshold and the street beyond and the sleeping city that knows nothing of what waits in this building. My hand shakes as I write in the incident log. The words come out cramped, barely legible. Statue repositioned. Possible foundation shift. Recommend structural inspection. The lies taste bitter, but what truth could I write? That the statues are alive? That they're hunting me? That I can feel their attention like pressure against my skin? I retreat to the security office and pull up the camera feed for the central hall. The timestamp shows continuous recording. No gaps, no errors. I rewind to 1:47 a.m., 13 minutes ago, when I was making my rounds in the eastern galleries. The screen shows Bologna in her previous position, facing north. I fast forward at regular speed. The statue remains motionless. The timestamp advances second by second. 1:48, 1:49, 1:50. Nothing changes. Nothing moves. Then at 1:51:37, between one frame and the next, she rotates. No intermediate positions, no blur of motion, simply present in one orientation, then present in another. The displacement occurs in the space between instants, in that infinitesimal gap where existence becomes uncertain. I watch it 3 times, each viewing more disturbing than the last. The motion defies physics, defies sense. It suggests rules that operate outside normal causation, suggests that the universe contains spaces where things that shouldn't be possible wait patiently for observation to lapse. The phone on my desk sits silent. I could call the police, report an intruder, summon witnesses to validate what I'm experiencing. But what would I tell them? That the statues are moving? They'd find me alone in a locked building, surrounded by stone figures that remain perfectly, provably still whenever anyone looks at them. Maybe that's the point. Maybe the horror isn't in the movement itself, but in the isolation it creates. The knowledge that nobody will believe. That the evidence exists only in the gaps between moments, in the spaces too brief for others to witness. The third round approaches. 3:30 a.m., the hour when the human body reaches its lowest ebb, when resistance falters and the mind slips toward darkness. I consider staying in the office, waiting out the shift in this cramped space with its flickering monitors and stale coffee smell. But procedure demands the rounds, and some part of me, the part that still believes in order and duty, insists I continue. The statues have moved again. The night has advanced down the west corridor, now standing at the intersection where it meets the central hall. The Centurion guards the opposite approach. The smaller pieces, busts of forgotten nobles, figurines of Greek heroes, have clustered near the exits like sentries. Every avenue of escape has been carefully, methodically closed, except the main entrance. That remains open, 3 meters from where Bologna stands with her broken spear and her stone face locked in eternal fury. The pattern is clear now. They're not trying to trap me in the building. They're herding me toward that single exit, creating a corridor with only one possible direction. And Bologna waits at the end, poised between me and freedom. My pulse hammers in my ears as I enter the central hall. The moonlight has shifted, painting different shadows across the floor. Bologna's face catches the light from an angle that makes the carved features seem almost mobile, as if expression might flicker across that ancient stone. 2 meters and 91 centimeters. I measure again with the rangefinder, needing the certainty of numbers. She's moved forward 9 centimeters since I last checked. 9 centimeters closer to the threshold, 9 centimeters closer to whatever lies beyond this building's walls. I back away slowly, keeping my eyes fixed on her form. The old wisdom about the weeping angels from that television show runs through my mind. Don't blink, don't look away. Observation is the only shield. But I can't watch forever. Eventually, I'll have to turn, have to proceed to the next room, have to check the east wing and the staff areas and all the other spaces that policy demands I inspect. The moment I break eye contact, she'll move again. I know this with absolute certainty. And the other statues will shift too, will tighten their formation, will eliminate another possible escape route. This is how it works. This is how she's operated for centuries, in museum after museum, country after country. The patient advance, the methodical elimination of options, the slow construction of a cage made from displaced stone and impossible geometry. What happens when she reaches the door? The archives didn't say. None of the previous incidents were documented with that kind of detail. Just vague references to trauma and resignation, to people found staring at nothing with eyes that couldn't quite focus on the present moment. My shift ends at 6 a.m. when the day guard arrives and the morning light burns away the worst of the shadows. 3 hours until sunrise. 3 hours until I can walk out of here and hand over responsibility to someone who doesn't yet know what waits in the central hall. But 3 hours might be too long. I force myself to continue the round, checking rooms with mechanical efficiency while my mind spirals through possibilities. Could I push her over? Would that work? Or would she simply reconstruct herself, pull her scattered pieces together through whatever force animates her? Could I cover her with something, block her line of sight to the door? But she moves without eyes, without any sensory apparatus I can identify or interrupt. The east wing is empty of statues now. They've all migrated toward the center, toward that crucial 3-meter gap between ancient fury and modern threshold. The galleries feel abandoned, their walls lined with paintings that seem to watch my passage with silent judgment. When I return to the central hall, the distance has decreased again. 2 meters and 77 centimeters. She's accelerating. I can smell something now. Not the usual museum scent of dust and preservation chemicals, but something older, earthier. Stone and clay and the minerals that comprise the ground itself. The smell of excavation, of things buried being brought to light. The other statues stand perfectly still, but I can feel their attention. It's like being in a room full of predators, each one frozen in the moment before the strike, each one waiting for permission to move. And Bologna is the key, the linchpin, the alpha of this strange pack. When she crosses the threshold, what constraints currently bind the others might shatter. My phone sits heavy in my pocket. I could document this, could take photos and videos, could create evidence that survives beyond my own testimony. But the thought of looking away long enough to focus a camera fills me with visceral dread. Those seconds of diverted attention might be all she needs to close the remaining distance. The fourth round comes at 4:30 a.m. Dawn is still an hour and a half away, but I can feel its approach in the way the darkness seems to thin, seems to lose some of its oppressive weight. The nighttime world is retreating, preparing to yield to the day. 2 meters and 51 centimeters. She's taken on a different quality in the past hour. The stone seems less static, less inert. I can almost see motion in the carved muscles, almost detect the suggestion of breathing in the rise and fall of her chest. It's probably my imagination, probably exhaustion playing tricks on my perception. But I've learned not to trust probability in this place. The archives mentioned something else, something I'd glossed over in my initial reading. The curator in Prague, the one found clawing at the walls. The report included a statement from the orderly who found him. The curator kept repeating a phrase in German. Sie wartet nicht mehr. She is no longer waiting. What had she been waiting for? What condition needed to be met? What threshold needed to be crossed? The answer sits heavy in my chest. The door. She's been waiting to reach the door, to cross from containment into the wider world. Every museum, every transfer, every relocation has been part of a journey measured in decades and centuries. And now, after so much time and distance, she's finally close enough to taste freedom. What would a goddess of war do, released into an unsuspecting city? My imagination supplies answers I don't want to consider. The statue itself might remain motionless, might stand as an innocuous piece of art while something else, something that wears her form without being constrained by stone, walks out into the night. Or maybe she'd simply stop, the animating force departing once its goal was achieved, leaving nothing but mysterious displacement and a night guard's questionable testimony. I don't know which possibility disturbs me more. The final round approaches. 5:30 a.m. 30 minutes until my relief arrives, until I can walk out into the gray pre-dawn and pretend this is someone else's problem. The eastern sky is beginning to lighten, that first tentative suggestion of coming day. 2 meters and 19 centimeters. She's so close now that I can see details I'd never noticed before. The individual chisel marks in the stone, the way the sculptor's hand shaped divine rage into something that transcends artistry and approaches truth. Her eyes are blank, pupilless, but they seem to track my movement across the hall. I position myself between her and the door. It's irrational, probably useless, but I can't just watch her advance unchallenged. If she moves again, she'll have to go through me. The minutes crawl past with geological slowness. My legs ache from standing. My eyes burn from refusing to blink for more than a second at a time. The morning light strengthens, painting the hall in shades of pearl and rose. Somewhere outside, the city is waking up. People are starting their day. Life is continuing in its normal rhythms. In here, I stand guard over a goddess who might be dreaming of escape. At 5:58 a.m., I hear the key in the front door. My relief has arrived early, probably eager to start his shift and get it over with. I should feel relieved, should welcome the company and the validation of another witness. Instead, I feel terror, because if I turn to greet him, if I break eye contact for even a second, she'll move. She'll close the final distance. We'll reach that threshold she's been approaching for weeks, or months, or years. And I have no idea what happens then. The door opens. Footsteps echo in the entrance hall, approaching the central room. My replacement calls out something cheerful about the weather, about morning traffic, about mundane things that belong to a world that makes sense. I don't turn. I don't look away. My eyes stay fixed on Bologna as she stands in her position of eternal fury, close enough now that I could touch her if I reached out, close enough that the smell of ancient stone fills my nostrils. The footsteps stop behind me. My replacement asks if I'm okay, says I look pale, suggests I should get some rest. His voice sounds distant, muffled, as if he's speaking from underwater or from behind thick glass, and in that moment, as my attention splits between his words and her presence, I feel rather than see the shift. The air moves differently. The shadows rearrange themselves. Something fundamental about the space changes, like a lock clicking open or a seal breaking. When I focus again, she hasn't moved. The rangefinder still shows 2 meters and 19 centimeters, but her face has changed. Or maybe I've finally learned to read the expression carved there 2,000 years ago. It's not fury. It never was. It's patience. My replacement touches my shoulder, concerned now, asking if I need to sit down. I finally break eye contact, finally turn to look at him. He seems solid, real, anchored in the daylight world of reasonable explanations. When I look back at Bologna, she stands exactly where she should be, 3 meters from the door. The distance has reset, returned to its original measurement. The other statues have returned to their display positions throughout the galleries, each one precisely where the catalog says it should be. But I know what I measured. I know what I saw in the camera footage, what I documented in my log. The evidence exists, scattered across notes and measurements in grainy video files. The day guard walks me to the office, insists I sit down, brings me water in a paper cup that shakes in my trembling hands. He suggests I take some time off, says the night shift can be tough on the nerves, mentions that the previous guard quit for similar reasons. Health concerns, he says. Stress-related issues. I nod and agree and say I'll think about it. But I'm already considering my options, already planning my resignation. Because I understand now. The game isn't about reaching the door. It's about the approach, the anticipation, the slow construction of dread in whoever stands watch. She feeds on it. They all do. The fear, the paranoia, the gradual erosion of certainty. That's what they've been waiting for. Not escape, but the psychological dismantling of everyone who tries to contain them. And the terrible thing, the thing that keeps my hands shaking and my breath short, is that I can't prove whether any of it was real. The measurements could have been mistakes. The camera footage could have been corrupted. The archives might have exaggerated historical incidents. Everything I experienced could be explained by exhaustion, by isolation, by a mind pushed too far by long nights in a building full of human-shaped stones. Or it could all be exactly what it seemed. I don't know which possibility frightens me more, that the statues are alive, or that I spent 6 weeks losing my mind so gradually I didn't notice until it was already gone. The morning light streams through the windows now, solid and reassuring. The day guard makes small talk about weekend plans as he prepares for his shift. Everything is normal, rational, explicable. But tonight, when darkness returns and the museum empties and some other guard makes their rounds through galleries full of watching stone, the statues will begin moving again. Centimeter by centimeter, hour by hour, night by night. Approaching something, always approaching, and whoever stands watch will measure and document and slowly realize they're not guarding the statues from the world. They're guarding the world from what waits in the stone. Or they're guarding nothing at all from the dissolution of their own sanity. I walk out into the morning, into the city that continues its oblivious existence, and I carry with me the certainty that I will never know which truth to believe. That uncertainty, I think, might be the point. Story 4. I'm writing this while I still remember what silence sounds like. They found the hikers 7 days after they went missing in the Whisperwood forest, all 5 of them sitting in a perfect circle around an old-growth Douglas fir, eyes open, mouths slack, completely unresponsive. The local hospital kept them for observation. One by one, over the course of 3 weeks, they came back, started talking again, and when they did, they all told the same story, down to the smallest detail. Word for word. Pause for pause. That's what made Dr. Reeves call me. I'd written extensively about mass psychogenic illness, shared delusions, folie à plusieurs. This seemed like a textbook case, until I actually listened to their testimonies. There was something in the way they spoke, a flatness to their affect that suggested they weren't remembering events so much as playing them back, like tape recorders, like echoes. The forest keeps sounds, they said. Everything that's ever happened there gets stored in the trees somehow, encoded in the wood itself, and sometimes, randomly, or maybe not randomly at all, these sounds replay. Conversations from decades ago, animal calls from species long extinct in the region, languages that hadn't been spoken in the area for centuries. But worse than hearing the past was hearing themselves, their own voices speaking words they hadn't yet said, warnings about things that hadn't yet happened. Temporal loops, one of them called it, auditory premonitions, future echoes. Of course, the rational explanation was trauma-induced shared hallucination, some kind of environmental factor, toxic spores, infrasound, mass hysteria, triggered by days of being lost and afraid. I was supposed to write about that, the psychological aspects, the social contagion of belief. I drove to Whisperwood on a Tuesday morning in October. The town that bordered the forest had the kind of quietness that felt deliberate, as if everyone had agreed not to speak too loudly. The diner where I stopped for coffee was half empty, and when I mentioned where I was headed, the waitress, her name tag said Dolores, simply topped off my cup without a word and walked away. Dr. Reeves met me at the ranger station. He was younger than I'd expected, maybe 35, with the kind of nervous energy that comes from not sleeping properly. He'd been studying the phenomenon for 2 months now, ever since the hikers were found. He pulled out a thick folder of data, sound recordings, dendrochronology reports, geological surveys of the area. The dendrochronology was what caught my attention. Reeves had partnered with a local university to take core samples from trees throughout Whisperwood. What they found defied conventional understanding. The tree rings showed anomalous density variations that corresponded with something. When they ran the variations through audio analysis software, treating the rings like a waveform, they got sounds. Actual, recognizable sounds. A woman's voice saying, "Help me." A child singing a nursery rhyme. The crack of a rifle shot. Animal calls, human screams. All embedded in the wood itself, in trees that were 200, 300 years old. The sounds were stored in the rings, laid down year by year, a biological recording medium that no one had ever suspected existed. Reeves told me about the thing they found at the center of the forest. Something buried. The geological surveys had detected a massive underground structure, stone or possibly metal, artificial in origin, predating any known settlement in the area by thousands of years. Since the hikers' disappearance, they'd noticed increased seismic activity. Nothing major, just tremors, but constant. A slow awakening, Reeves had called it in his notes. He asked if I wanted to see the forest. Of course I did. That's why I'd come. We entered Whisperwood at noon, when the sun was high enough to penetrate the canopy. The trail the missing hikers had taken was well marked. Nothing dangerous about it. Popular with families during summer. The trees were massive. Old-growth forest. Some of the specimens dating back 400 or 500 years. Douglas fir, western red cedar, bigleaf maple. Their trunks were so wide that 3 people linking hands couldn't encircle them. The first thing I noticed was the quiet. Not absence of sound exactly, but a muffled quality, as if the air itself absorbed noise. Our footsteps on the trail seemed too loud, wrong somehow. Reeves walked ahead of me, checking his equipment, a digital recorder, a portable spectrograph, some kind of modified seismometer. We were maybe 2 miles in when I heard it. A voice, male, distant, saying something I couldn't quite make out. I stopped walking. Reeves noticed and turned back, raising an eyebrow. I asked him if he'd heard anything. He said the forest was full of sounds, birds, wind, branches rubbing together. People heard what they expected to hear out here. But I knew what I'd heard. It was too distinct, too clearly human to be mistaken for natural sounds. We kept walking. The second time, it was closer. A woman's voice speaking rapidly in what sounded like French. Not modern French. Something older, the pronunciation archaic. It came from somewhere to our left, deep in the trees where the trail didn't go. Reeves heard it too this time. He checked his recorder, confirmed it had picked up the sound. We stood there, listening to the playback. Clear as a bell. a woman speaking French, her voice trembling with fear or excitement, words I couldn't understand. Reeves explained that this was common, that the forest seemed to replay sounds at random, though there were patterns. Certain areas were more active than others. The closer you got to the center, to that buried structure, the more frequent the phenomena became, the more complex. We pressed on. The trail narrowed, becoming less maintained. I started noticing things about the trees. Markings on the bark. Some looked like writing, symbols, maybe letters and alphabets I didn't recognize. Others looked like claw marks, but too regular, too purposeful. Reeves said the original inhabitants of the area, before colonization, had considered the forest sacred, forbidden. No one went to the center. No one knew exactly why anymore. The stories had been lost. Around 3 in the afternoon, I heard my own voice. It came from behind us, back down the trail. I heard myself ask Reeves if he'd heard anything. The exact words I'd spoken 2 hours earlier, the same inflection, the same pause before the question. I felt something cold settle in my stomach. Reeves noticed my expression and nodded grimly. He told me the forest was learning us now, recording our presence, and it would begin to replay us soon. Sometimes moments after we spoke, sometimes before. Before. The word hung in the air between us. We reached what Reeves called the boundary zone around 4:30. The light was starting to fade, filtered through the dense canopy into a greenish twilight. Here the trees were even larger, their trunks twisted and gnarled in ways that didn't seem natural. The bark had a strange texture, almost scaly, and when I touched it, it felt warm. Not sun warm, body warm. The sounds were constant now. Voices, animal calls, music, mechanical noises that shouldn't exist in a primordial forest, engines, sirens, electronic beeps. All of it layered and overlapping, creating a cacophony that somehow didn't quite overwhelm the underlying silence. It was as if the sounds existed in a different space, occupying the same physical location but not quite intersecting with present reality. Then I heard it. My own voice, speaking words I hadn't said yet, telling Reeves that we needed to leave, that something was wrong, that the trees were breathing. I looked at Reeves and saw my own fear reflected in his face. The recording had just played something that hadn't happened. Future echo, temporal loop. Except it had happened, hadn't it? Because I'd just heard myself say it, which meant I would say it. Had to say it to close the loop. Unless... I kept my mouth shut, refused to speak the words. If I didn't say them, if I broke the loop, what would happen? The forest seemed to notice. The sounds changed, became more agitated. I heard laughter, my own laughter, but wrong somehow, unhinged. I heard Reeves shouting, heard my name being called by a voice that might have been my wife's, but distorted, stretched. I heard languages I'd never learned, speaking words I somehow understood. Warnings, pleas, accusations. Reeves was checking his instruments frantically. The seismometer was going crazy. The tremors were increasing. He told me we had to get closer to the center, that this was unprecedented activity, that we might be witnessing something significant. But his voice shook when he said it. He didn't want to go closer any more than I did. We went anyway. What else could we do? We'd come this far. The center of Whisperwood wasn't marked on any maps. There was no trail leading to it. But the trees seemed to guide us, their positions creating natural corridors, paths that led inexorably inward. The sounds were deafening now, centuries of noise compressed and overlapping, a wall of audio chaos that should have been unbearable, but instead felt almost soothing, like white noise. My thoughts began to blur at the edges. We found the structure just before full dark. It rose from the forest floor like a broken tooth. Stone, or something like stone, black and glassy and covered in those same symbols I'd seen carved into the trees. But these were older, deeper, cut by something that understood the material intimately. The structure was partially buried, but what was visible suggested something massive underneath. A building, a machine, a tomb. The trees surrounding it were the oldest I'd ever seen. Their trunks were impossibly wide, their bark so thick and ridged it looked like armor. and they were vibrating, pulsing, each one moving in rhythm with the others, a slow, synchronous undulation that matched the tremors in the ground. I realized with creeping horror that they were breathing. The trees were breathing. Reeves approached the structure, entranced. He placed his hand on its surface and jerked back immediately. He told me it was hot, not just warm, hot enough to burn. And it was vibrating too, a deep subsonic rumble that I could feel in my bones. That's when we heard the voice, not from a recording, not an echo, something speaking in real time, emerging from the structure itself or perhaps from all the trees at once. It spoke in a language I'd never heard, but somehow comprehended on a level deeper than words. It said, "I remember you. I have always remembered you." Reeves was saying something about sound waves and resonance frequencies and mycorrhizal networks, trying to rationalize what we were hearing, but I wasn't listening. Because I understood now. The forest wasn't recording sounds passively. It was learning, studying. Every voice it captured, every conversation, every scream and laugh and whispered secret. It was analyzing them, understanding them, learning about us, about humanity, building a picture of what we were through the echoes we left behind. And the thing beneath the structure, the thing that was waking up, it was using that information. It had been asleep for thousands of years, buried and dormant, but the sounds had sustained it somehow, fed it, and now, with enough data collected, enough patterns established, it was ready to interact. I heard my wife's voice calling my name, but my wife was 200 miles away, had been for 3 days. I heard my father, dead for 10 years, asking me if I was okay. I heard myself as a child, crying, asking why no one would listen. The forest was pulling sounds from my memory, or pulling memories that would become sounds, or time felt wrong, elastic. I couldn't remember if we'd already found the structure or were still looking for it. Reeves was saying something, but his mouth wasn't syncing with the words. They arrived before his lips moved, or maybe after. I couldn't tell anymore. The voice from the structure spoke again. "You carry the world in your echoes. Show me more." We ran, or I think we ran. Movement became confused with memory of movement, with anticipation of movement. The trees seemed to shift around us, but maybe we were the ones shifting, unstuck from the proper sequence of moments. I heard myself screaming, but my mouth was closed. I heard Reeves fall, but he was still beside me. I heard the forest laugh with my voice, with every voice it had ever captured. I don't remember reaching the trail, don't remember driving back. The next clear memory I have is sitting in my hotel room, staring at my digital recorder, listening to the sounds we'd captured. My own voice, saying things I didn't remember saying. Reeves, describing observations he never made. And underneath it all, that subsonic rumble, that voice that wasn't quite a voice, saying over and over, "I remember you." Dr. Reeves called me the next morning, said he'd sent the samples and recordings to multiple labs for analysis, said we'd have concrete answers soon about what was really happening in that forest. But his voice sounded flat, recorded. He used the exact words I'd predicted he would use the moment before he said them. I left town that afternoon, drove straight through, 14 hours, stopping only for gas. I needed to get away from those trees, from those sounds, from the possibility that everything I said, or thought, or remembered was just an echo playing out, predetermined and inevitable. But here's what keeps me awake at night. 3 days after I got home, I received a package. No return address. Inside was a wooden disc, a cross-section of a tree, maybe 6 inches in diameter, sealed in resin. A note attached said it was from Dr. Reeves, a sample from one of the old-growth Douglas firs near the center. I've been studying the rings. There are 347 of them, each one containing variations in density too precise to be natural. I've mapped them, treated them as data points, run them through audio software the way Reeves described. The sounds they contain are impossible. I hear myself writing this sentence. I hear the keys of my laptop, the specific rhythm of my typing, the pause before I delete and rewrite. I hear my own breathing. the exact pattern of it, from a position somewhere behind my right shoulder. I hear my wife coming home tomorrow and asking me if I'm okay, a conversation that hasn't happened yet. I hear my own death. Not the moment of it, but the silence after. The specific quality of absence where my sounds should be. The forest has always been recording, not just for decades or centuries. The structure is older than human presence in North America, older than anatomically modern humans. It's been recording everything, every sound the earth has made, storing it in trees that live for centuries, creating an archive of existence itself. And something underneath is using that archive to learn, to understand causality and time and the patterns that connect all moments to all other moments. I can hear it now, even here, hundreds of miles away. A whisper under every sound, my own voice, speaking words I haven't thought yet. The voice from the structure, patient and curious. Show me more. I remember you. I will always remember you. I've started to wonder if I ever left the forest at all. If maybe I'm still standing at the center, next to that black stone structure, and everything since, the drive home, the package, this moment right now, is just an echo. A future that the forest is replaying for something that's learning to be human by listening to our sounds, practicing our patterns. Sometimes I hear my own voice saying, I'm writing this while I still remember what silence sounds like. But I said that days ago, at the beginning of all this, didn't I? The tree ring sample sits on my desk. I've been counting the rings again, and I've noticed something. There are more now than when I first counted. New rings appearing on wood that was already dead and fossilized when it was cut, growing backwards through time, or forward, or in directions that don't have names yet. I can hear it adding me to the archive. Every word I speak, every thought I think, captured and stored and played back to something that's learning what it means to exist in time. And I wonder, have I been writing this because I chose to, or because I already heard myself write it, echoing from a future or a past that are the same thing to whatever is learning beneath Whisperwood? The worst part is that I'm starting to recognize the pattern, the rhythm of my own existence, looping and replaying, branching and merging. I'm starting to understand what those hikers felt, why they went catatonic. It's not horror that breaks you. It's the realization that you've never been speaking at all. You've always been an echo, playing out variations on a theme that something else composed. I can hear myself finishing this sentence before I write it. I can hear you reading it before you do. The forest remembers everything, even this, especially this. Story 5. The bookstore smelled of mildew and decay, that particular scent of paper slowly surrendering to time. I'd passed the place 100 times on my way to the coffee shop where I pretended to write, but something different pulled me through its door that Tuesday afternoon. The bell above chimed, a hollow, discordant sound that seemed to echo longer than physics should allow. The proprietor, an elderly man whose face I can no longer recall with any clarity, gestured vaguely toward the back when I asked about rare manuscripts. The motion felt rehearsed, inevitable, as if we were both following a script neither of us had read. I found it wedged between a water-damaged encyclopedia and a collection of Victorian poetry. The binding was leather, cracked and worn, with no title embossed on its spine. My fingers tingled when I touched it, not metaphorically, but with actual pins and needles sensation that traveled up my forearms. I should have put it back then. I tell myself that often now, though I'm no longer certain it would have mattered. The first page made my breath catch in my throat. He found it wedged between a water-damaged encyclopedia and a collection of Victorian poetry. I read it 3 times, certain I was misunderstanding. But there it was, describing this exact moment in past tense, as if it had already happened, as if I were merely catching up to events already written and concluded. The manuscript continued for another 200 pages, dense with detail. My childhood home was there, the cracked tile in the upstairs bathroom that my parents never fixed, the way light filtered through the elm tree outside my bedroom window on summer mornings. It described my first kiss with Evelyn behind the gymnasium, how her lips tasted of cherry lip gloss and uncertainty, It knew about the manuscript I'd hidden in my desk drawer for 3 years, the novel I'd never shown anyone, complete with passages I'd deleted and never saved anywhere. But it was the intimate moments that truly unnerved me. The time I'd cried alone in my car after my father's funeral, the specific words I'd whispered to myself, the night I'd stood on the bridge for 40 minutes, keys in hand, weighing choices I'd never admitted to anyone, things I barely admitted to myself. I bought the manuscript without asking the price. The old man took my money with that same vague gesture, his eyes never quite meeting mine. When I asked him where it came from, he simply said it had been there as long as he could remember. The words felt hollow, scripted. At home, I spread the manuscript across my kitchen table under the harsh LED light. The pages smelled of vanilla and something sharper, almost medicinal. I skipped ahead, unable to help myself, past events I recognized into territory I didn't. Tomorrow, or what the manuscript called tomorrow, I would wake at 6:47 a.m. to the sound of rain against my window. I would make coffee but forget to add water, standing confused as the machine sputtered and died. At 2:15 p.m. I would receive a phone call from Evelyn, my ex-wife, about something urgent she couldn't discuss over the phone. The next pages detailed the following 6 days, with the same eerie precision. Each day built upon the last, a careful choreography of mundane moments that somehow felt loaded with significance. And then came the final entry. On the 7th day, at 11:34 p.m., he will walk into the storage room of his apartment building. He will understand then, as the others did, that some stories choose their endings long before their narrators realize they're characters rather than authors. The manuscript will be found with his... The sentence ended there, unfinished, as if the writer had been interrupted, or as if the ending was so obvious it didn't need stating. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I researched, laptop glowing in the darkness of my apartment. I found her online after 2 hours of digging through obituaries and old news articles. A woman named Helena, a journalist who died 6 months ago. Her apartment had been burgled shortly after, and among the items never recovered was a leather-bound manuscript she'd been working on. Then another woman, Iris, a painter, 2 years before that. A pattern emerged, though the details were sparse, deliberately vague in the way tragic stories often are. When I woke, at 6:47 a.m. to rain against my window, I wanted to believe I'd influenced myself through suggestion. The mind is powerful that way, creating self-fulfilling prophecies. But when I stumbled to the kitchen, still half asleep, and poured coffee grounds into the machine without adding water, my hands began to shake. I didn't wait for the machine to sputter and die. I pulled the plug and stepped away from it, breathing hard, as if I'd narrowly avoided something terrible. The manuscript was where I'd left it on the table. I approached it slowly, afraid of what I'd find. The pages looked the same at first glance, but when I reached today's entry, new words had appeared beneath the original text. He pulled the plug before the machine could sputter and die. He thought this meant something, that he'd altered the course. He didn't understand yet that deviation was just another form of obedience. My phone rang at 2:15 p.m. Evelyn's name glowed on the screen. I let it go to voicemail, pacing my apartment as it rang, each chime feeling like a countdown. She left a message asking me to call her back, that it was urgent, but she couldn't discuss it over the phone. Every single word. The manuscript had known she'd leave a voicemail. It had known I wouldn't answer. I grabbed the manuscript and ran to my car, not sure where I was going, just knowing I needed to leave. I'd drive somewhere, anywhere, and throw the thing away. Burn it, maybe. The weight of inevitability was suffocating, each breath feeling preordained, each thought potentially scripted. But I didn't make it out of the parking lot. My car wouldn't start, the engine turning over with that distinctive clicking sound that meant a dead battery. I'd had it checked 2 weeks ago. Everything had been fine. I walked back inside, manuscript clutched against my chest, and found new text waiting on the page describing today. He tried to leave. The car wouldn't start. By evening, he would return to his apartment and find the manuscript changed again, grown fuller, as if his resistance was feeding it, giving it more material to work with. Each attempt to escape would be catalogued, documented, absorbed into the narrative he could not outrun. I don't know how long I stood there, reading and rereading those words. The light changed outside my window, afternoon sliding into evening, shadows lengthening across the pages. When I looked up, it was dark. The next days blurred together, a strange doubling of experience. I lived my life while simultaneously reading about having lived it. I tried everything, staying in bed all day, taking a bus to a neighboring city, checking myself into a hotel under a false name. Each action appeared in the manuscript the following morning, described with that same clinical precision, always noting how my attempts to change things were themselves part of the pattern. I stopped eating, unsure if hunger was genuine or simply following script. I stopped sleeping, but exhaustion would pull me under eventually, and I'd wake to find more pages filled in, chronicling my fitful dreams. On the 5th day, I noticed something I'd missed before. At the bottom of certain pages, in the margins, were initials, HMIK. Other letters I couldn't make out, faded with time, Helena, Iris, and others. They'd all written in the margins, tiny notations of their own attempts to escape, their own discovery of the pattern. One note from Helena was still legible. It knows what we'll do because we're already doing it. Past, present, future. It's all one moment to the manuscript. We're not moving toward the ending. We've always been at the ending. I wanted to call someone, but who could I tell? How do you explain that your life has been written in a book you found after it was already written? That every choice you make is documented before you make it? They'd think I was having a breakdown, and perhaps I was. Perhaps I am. The manuscript never clarifies the nature of madness versus reality. It simply describes both with equal conviction. On the 6th day, I finally visited Evelyn. She lived across town now, in a small house with a garden she'd always wanted. She made tea, and we sat in her kitchen, and I found myself describing the manuscript, the words spilling out of me in a torrent. She listened with that patient expression I remembered from our marriage, the one she'd worn when I'd talk about my writing, about stories that consumed me. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment. Then she told me about her own struggles since the divorce, the therapy she'd started, the medications that helped her sleep. She said creative minds sometimes turned on themselves, that the stress of trying to write, of feeling like life was slipping away unwritten, could manifest in strange ways. Her words were kind, careful, and I hated myself for seeing them as just another scene in the manuscript, another moment of scripted concern. Was she real, or was she too just a character? Were any of us anything more than text on a page? That night, I opened the manuscript to the final entry. Tomorrow night, 11:34 p.m. The storage room. He will walk into the storage room of his apartment building. He will understand then, as the others did, that some stories choose their endings long before their narrators realize they're characters rather than authors. The manuscript will be found with his. The sentence still ended there, unfinished. I spent the day, my last day according to the manuscript, trying to understand what it meant. Understanding seemed important, as if comprehension itself might be the key to breaking free. I reread every page, looking for clues, for some hidden mechanism that would explain how the manuscript worked. Was it supernatural? A psychological projection? Had I written it myself during some fugue state and forgotten? Each theory felt both completely true and utterly false. As the clock moved closer to 11:34 p.m., I felt a pull I couldn't explain. Not physical, but something deeper, like a narrative current I'd been swimming against for 6 days, and now the exhaustion was too much. Every muscle in my body ached from the resistance. At 11:30 p.m., I found myself in the hallway outside my apartment, manuscript in hand. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting everything in a sickly yellow-green. The storage room door was at the end of the hall, painted the same institutional beige as everything else. I walked toward it, each step feeling both chosen and inevitable. Was I walking because the manuscript said I would? Or did the manuscript say I would, because I was always going to walk? The question folded in on itself. a Mobius strip of causality that made my head spin. At 11:33 p.m., my hand touched the doorknob. It was cold, so cold it almost burned. I could feel the metal's texture, every imperfection in the brass, with hyper-real clarity. This was the moment everything led to, the moment everything led from. I opened the door. The storage room was exactly as I remembered it. Concrete walls, dim bulb hanging from a wire, my boxes stacked in the corner along with the forgotten possessions of other tenants. But there, in the center of the room, was something new. A desk. Simple, wooden, with a single chair. And on the desk, a blank manuscript, leather-bound, identical to the one in my hands except for one crucial detail. This one was empty. Next to it, a pen. Old-fashioned, the kind filled with ink that stains fingers and paper with equal permanence. I understood then, standing in that storage room as the clock on my phone turned to 11:34 p.m., what the manuscript had never directly stated. The unfinished sentence wasn't a mystery, it was an invitation, an instruction. The manuscript will be found with his what? His possessions? His body? Or something else entirely? I looked down at the manuscript in my hands, then at the empty one on the desk. Both identical, both waiting. The one I held was full of someone else's story that had become mine. The empty one was waiting for its next reader, its next narrator, its next inevitability. The pattern was clear now. Find the manuscript. Read your life. Try to escape. Fail. And then you add your own initials to the margins, your own desperate notes to the next person, and you leave the manuscript somewhere for the next writer to find, the next person seeking inspiration in secondhand bookstores, the next fool who thinks they're telling stories instead of being told by them. But there was still a choice here, wasn't there? I could refuse. I could walk away from the empty manuscript, let the pattern break with me. I could burn both books and be done with it. I'm writing this now, these very words you're reading, because I need to document what happened next, or what's happening, or what has always been happening. The tenses blur together when you're living in a story that's already been written. I picked up the pen. The ink is dark and thick, and as it touches the first page of the empty manuscript, I realize I'm not starting a new story. I'm continuing one that began long before me, with other writers, other people who found themselves in storage rooms with empty manuscripts and full ones, trying to understand the difference between author and character. My hand moves across the page, and I don't know if I'm choosing the words or if the words are choosing me. I write about a writer who finds a manuscript. I write about how it knows everything about him. I write about his attempts to escape. I write about the storage room. And tomorrow, or perhaps today, or perhaps in some other configuration of time that the manuscript understands better than I do, someone else will find this story in a bookstore that smells of mildew and decay. They'll read about themselves. They'll try to escape. They'll fail. They'll find themselves in a storage room at 11:34 p.m., understanding too late that narrators and characters are just different names for the same trap. I can hear footsteps in the hallway outside, slow, deliberate, approaching. But I'm not afraid anymore. Fear requires uncertainty, and I understand now that there is no uncertainty here. Only continuation. Only the next chapter. Only the eternal present tense of a story that has no beginning, because it has no end. The door opens behind me. I don't turn around. I keep writing, because that's what narrators do. We write until we become characters, and then we write some more. And somewhere in that transformation, the difference between creating a story and being created by one dissolves entirely. My hand moves faster now, filling page after page. The footsteps stop. Someone is reading over my shoulder, reading about themselves, reading over my shoulder, and I wonder if they understand yet. I wonder if understanding matters. I wonder if wondering is just another scene I'm writing, or if I've been written to wonder. The last thing I write before my hand goes numb, before the pen falls from my fingers and the ink blots across the final page, is this. Tomorrow, you will find a manuscript in a bookstore. It will know things it shouldn't know. You will try to escape. You will end up here, in this storage room, with this pen in your hand, and these words flowing from you like confession, like inevitability, like the only story that was ever yours to tell because it was never yours at all. And you will understand that some stories don't end. They just find new narrators. It's your turn now. Pick up the pen. Story 6. The air tasted wrong that morning. Metallic almost. Like licking a battery terminal, my colleague used to say, back when we still joked about things. That was before the eclipse, before I understood that some separations are permanent. I should have noticed it immediately. The way my shadow stayed on the sidewalk outside the laboratory entrance while I walked through the door. But the mind protects itself with mundane explanations. A trick of the light, a malfunction in the automated doors, the exhaustion of 3 consecutive nights monitoring solar activity. I chalked it up to pre-eclipse jitters and descended into the observation facility. The eclipse itself was scheduled for 10:47 a.m. Pacific Standard Time. Total duration, 4 minutes and 12 seconds. Our team had prepared for months, calibrating equipment, triple-checking protocols. Dr. Reeves insisted we wear the protective glasses even inside the facility, even though our instruments would do the observing. She was always thorough to the point of paranoia. I wonder now if she somehow knew. When totality hit, everything electronic in the building stuttered. Not a blackout exactly, but a hesitation, as if the power itself needed to catch its breath. The backup generators kicked in with their usual groan, but something felt different. The fluorescent lights buzzed at a frequency that made my molars ache. Through the reinforced observation window, the sun became a black hole in the sky, corona flaring around it like frozen fire. That's when the screaming started upstairs. Not panic screaming. Worse. The kind of screaming that comes from a place beyond fear, where the mind encounters something it cannot categorize. I took the stairs 3 at a time, my footsteps echoing in a way they shouldn't have. Delayed, as if the sound needed to travel through something denser than air. The main floor was chaos. People stood motionless, staring at the ground, at walls, at empty spaces beside them. Someone was crying. The emergency exit door hung open, flooding the room with that strange totality darkness that wasn't quite darkness at all. And everywhere, there were shadows. But they weren't where they should be. Mine stood by the water cooler, arms crossed, mimicking my posture but not my position. I could see it clearly even though I stood 20 feet away. The thing had depth, texture, a solidity that normal shadows don't possess. While I watched, it tilted its head, a gesture I hadn't made. Dr. Reeves grabbed my arm. Her fingers felt distant, as if she was touching me through layers of plastic wrap. Her shadow was doing something obscene against the wall, gestures I won't describe, movements that made my stomach clench. She didn't look at it. None of us wanted to look directly at them. The eclipse ended. The shadows remained. The first 24 hours were pandemonium. News networks tried to explain it as mass hysteria, as hoax, as anything rational. But you can't fake shadows that move independently across every time zone touched by totality. The internet exploded with videos, shadows waving from windows, shadows walking in opposite directions from their owners, shadows that seemed to be plotting. That night, I couldn't sleep. My apartment felt wrong, angled slightly off, walls not quite where they should be. Every time I turned on a light, I expected to see it. My shadow, standing in the doorway, watching. The bedroom was safer in darkness, I reasoned. Shadows can't exist without light. I was wrong. Around 3 a.m. I felt the cold. Not the ordinary cold of a winter night, but something deeper. Arctic cold that seemed to emanate from beneath my bed, from the corners of the room, from nowhere and everywhere. My breath came out in clouds. The thermostat read 72 degrees. When I finally braved turning on the lamp, it was there, standing at the foot of my bed. My shadow. But the light source was wrong for its position. Shadows obey physics. They follow rules. Except mine didn't anymore. It stood independent of any light source, darker than the darkness around it, somehow more real than the walls behind it. We stared at each other. I won't pretend I didn't scream. It copied the movement a half-second later, mouth opening in a silent mockery of my terror. Then it pointed, one long, dark finger extending toward my chest. I looked down and saw nothing unusual. When I looked up again, it had moved closer. Not walked, just existed closer. The way things move in dreams. I fled to the bathroom, locked the door, turned on every light. The fluorescent buzz filled my head. In the mirror, my reflection looked tired, pale, almost translucent around the edges, though that had to be the lighting. Behind me, in the mirror, I could see the bathroom door, closed, locked. My shadow stood on the other side of it. I could see it through the door, as if the wood had become one-way glass. It pressed both palms against the barrier and waited. I spent the rest of the night in that bathroom, lights blazing, trying not to look at the mirror. By day 3, the scientific community had mobilized. Emergency meetings, hastily assembled task forces, theories ranging from quantum entanglement to mass psychological breaks. I returned to the laboratory because staying home meant being alone with it, and being alone with it was unthinkable. Dr. Reeves had assembled a core team. 8 of us crammed into conference room B, windows covered with blackout curtains, multiple light sources creating a confusion of shadows that made it harder for them to do what they did, to watch, to wait. She had data, measurements, evidence that sounded like fever dreams. The shadows had mass, or something analogous to mass. They could affect other shadows, cause them to ripple and distort. Temperature dropped wherever they concentrated, and most disturbing, electromagnetic readings suggested they were composed of the same matter as us, just inverted somehow. Negative space made positive. One researcher, Chen from the physics department, proposed a theory that made everyone fall silent. During the eclipse, he suggested, the alignment of sun, moon, and earth created a specific gravitational field that allowed something to slip through. A reflection, a duplicate, existing in the spaces between light and matter. They had always been there, he insisted, just waiting for the right conditions to separate. Someone asked the question we all feared. What did they want? Chen pulled up a graph on his tablet. 2 lines, one ascending, one descending. The ascending line represented the shadow's increasing solidity. Multiple reports confirmed it. Shadows that could now disturb dust particles, create noticeable drafts, influence loose papers. The descending line represented us, our apparent density, our presence in the physical world. Both lines were scheduled to intersect in approximately 11 days. The implications sat heavy in the recycled air of conference room B. If the shadows were becoming more real, and we were becoming less real, then at the point of intersection, Dr. Reeves spoke quietly, as if afraid her own shadow might overhear from where it crouched in the corner, pretending not to listen. She explained that the shadows weren't trying to destroy us. They were trying to replace us, to trade places, to become the solid ones while we faded into the spaces between. I felt my hand against the table, felt the wood's resistance against my palm, and tried to convince myself it was as solid as it had been last week. But there was something insubstantial about the sensation now, like pressing against a balloon instead of oak. That night, it followed me home. No one said the words quarantine or evacuation, but the streets were emptying. People holed up in their houses with all the lights on or all the lights off, no one agreeing which was safer. I passed a church with every window illuminated, shadows of the congregation dancing against the stained glass, moving independently of the bodies inside. My apartment building was silent except for the hum of electricity, everyone burning lights like their lives depended on it. Maybe they did. I took the stairs instead of the elevator, too many shadows in small spaces, and found my door ajar. I knew I'd locked it. The apartment was dark. I reached for the light switch, then stopped. Something about the quality of darkness inside felt occupied, lived in. I could hear breathing that wasn't mine, a rhythm slightly off from my own. When I finally forced my hand to the switch, the lights revealed an empty apartment. But everything was wrong. Furniture slightly rearranged, books on different shelves. The coffee mug I'd left in the sink was now in the cabinet. Someone had been living here, mimicking my life, learning my patterns. My shadow stood in front of the window, backlit by the city lights, more solid than I'd ever seen it. When I moved, it didn't. When I stepped right, it stepped left. Mirror image. Opposite. It raised one hand, and I felt a corresponding coldness in my own chest, as if it was reaching inside me. I spent that night at the laboratory, sleeping on the break room couch, all lights blazing, surrounded by colleagues who no longer trusted their own silhouettes. Day 7. The intersection point revised to 9 days away. Some people were already translucent enough to see through. You could watch their organs working, hearts pumping, lungs expanding, everything becoming visible as their skin lost opacity. Meanwhile, the shadows grew faces. Not human faces exactly, but the suggestion of features. Hollow eyes, gaping mouths, the architecture of something trying to be human. Dr. Reeves stopped coming to meetings. Her shadow had learned to hold pens, to write equations on whiteboards. We found her at her desk, staring at her hands, which had become so transparent that light passed straight through them. The shadow version of her stood nearby, holding a coffee mug, actually holding it, the ceramic responding to its grip, and drinking, swallowing, learning. Chen's theory evolved. He no longer called them shadows. He called them the primary versions, and us the projections. We had it backwards, he said. We were never the originals. We were always the shadows, the echoes, the light-dependent copies. The eclipse simply reminded us of what we really were. I stopped sleeping. Couldn't risk closing my eyes with it in the room, growing stronger, practicing being alive. My reflection in windows was barely visible now, just a suggestion of a person, while my shadow had developed texture, dimension, the appearance of weight. I watched it learn to manipulate doorknobs, though it still couldn't quite manage the physical resistance. Not yet. The city had fallen into a strange silence broken only by occasional screams. People who'd accepted their fate. People who'd tried to fight and discovered you can't fight your own absence. Some locked themselves in rooms with no light sources, thinking darkness would protect them. Others stood under stadium lights, creating such a confusion of shadows that they hoped theirs couldn't find them. None of it worked. Day 9, and I could see through my own hand to the wall behind it. My footsteps made no sound. When I spoke, my voice seemed to come from far away, as if I was shouting down a tunnel. The physical world was becoming theoretical to me, a place I visited rather than inhabited. My shadow was eating dinner at my table. I don't know what it ate, or where it got the food, but I watched it go through the motions, fork to mouth, chewing, swallowing. It was getting better at pretending, at being. It wore my face now, or a version of it, features emerging from the darkness like a photograph developing. When it saw me watching, it smiled with teeth that were somehow darker than darkness should allow. We stared at each other across the apartment, across the diminishing space between shadow and substance. It moved its mouth, and I heard my own voice speaking words I didn't say. The air around it felt heavy, almost liquid, while the air around me felt thin, insufficient. I tried to grab a chair, to throw it, to do something physical and real and human. My hands passed through the wood like it was made of smoke. The chair didn't move, but when my shadow reached out, the chair scraped across the floor with a sound that made my teeth ache. It was real now. I was not. I don't know what day it is anymore. The laboratory is empty, or maybe I just can't see anyone. Maybe everyone else has already completed the transition, and I'm the last one still clinging to the fiction of solidity. The lights still work when I try to turn them on, but I can't tell if I'm actually flipping the switches or just remembering how to. My shadow doesn't follow me anymore. It goes about its day, my day, eating meals I can't taste, sitting in chairs I can't touch, living in a world that no longer acknowledges my existence. Sometimes I see other shadows passing in the street, casting human-shaped darkness in their wake. Brief projections of light and absence. Temporary. Forgettable. Was there ever a difference? Chen's question echoes in what remains of my thoughts. Maybe we were always just the negative space, the absence of light that pretends to be presence. Maybe the eclipse didn't change anything. It just showed us what we really were. I watch my shadow. No, I watch myself. Lock the apartment door and head to work. To my work. To the laboratory where I used to do research on solar phenomena. It walks with purpose, casting a pale, translucent shadow behind it. The shadow that used to be me. Sometimes I try to touch things, to remind myself I was real once. My hand passes through walls, through people, through the entire substance of the world. I am the shadow now, the projection, the light-dependent echo. I exist only in the spaces between. The sun is setting. Soon it will be dark, and in the dark, shadows have no reason to exist at all. I wonder if I'll disappear completely when the last light goes out, or if I'll linger somehow. A memory of shape without substance, a negative space that once thought it was a man. In the window glass, I can barely see my reflection anymore. But in the street below, my shadow. No, the primary me, the real me, walks confidently home, solid and certain and unquestionably alive. And I finally understand. I was never stolen. I was never even here. Story 7. The itching started 3 days after I woke up with the tree on my forearm. I remember fragments of that night, the bar's amber lighting, the stranger with ink-stained fingers who bought me drinks, the buzz of a tattoo gun that might have been real, or might have been the fluorescent lights overhead. When I stumbled into my apartment at dawn, I collapsed onto my bed without looking at myself. The hangover came first, brutal and deserved. The tree came second. It was simple then. Just a trunk, barely 3 inches tall, rendered in deep brown ink that seemed to shimmer oddly in the morning light. No signature, no receipt, no memory of agreeing to permanent body art. I told myself it could have been worse. At least it wasn't someone's name or a crude joke etched into my skin forever. But simple didn't last. By the 4th day, the first branch had appeared, curling upward from the trunk like a question mark. I stared at it in my bathroom mirror, tracing the new line with a trembling finger. Ink didn't grow, tattoos didn't change, yet there it was, reaching toward my elbow with undeniable presence. The itch had localized there, right where the new growth emerged, a sensation that felt less like healing skin and more like something burrowing deeper. I called the health clinic and described the symptoms in vague terms. A reaction to new ink, possible infection, spreading redness. The nurse asked if I'd been to a licensed establishment. I couldn't answer. She scheduled me for the following week, told me to keep it clean and watch for fever. I hung up feeling the itch intensify, as if the tree had heard me trying to remove it. The research started that night. I searched for everything: tattoo infections, ink allergies, delayed reactions, cellular changes in dermis layers. The results were clinical and useless. Tattoos were permanent precisely because they didn't change. The ink particles were too large for the body to absorb, trapped forever in the skin's middle layer. Growth was impossible. Evolution was impossible. I found the first reference to the ash on a forum buried 6 pages deep in search results. Someone with the username Willow Ghost had posted about unusual tattoo ink sources, mentioning an underground artist who used organic materials from significant sites. The post was 3 years old. No one had replied, but they'd included a phrase that made my skin prickle. Ink made from the last ashes carries the last voices. That night, I heard the first whisper. It came while I was half asleep, a sound so faint I almost mistook it for the wind through my bedroom window. But the window was closed. The sound was closer, more intimate, vibrating through my forearm where the tree now spread its branches. 3 of them, I'd counted obsessively, across my skin. The whisper held no words I could distinguish, just a rhythm that felt like language, urgent and ancient and desperate. I turned on every light in my apartment and didn't sleep until dawn. The dermatologist appointment came on day 9. By then, the tree had sprouted tiny leaves, each one rendered in ink, so detailed I could see individual veins. The trunk had thickened, and roots had begun creeping down toward my wrist in thin, seeking tendrils. The doctor, a woman with tired eyes and coffee breath, examined my arm with professional detachment that crumbled as she looked closer. "This isn't possible," she said, then caught herself. "I mean, the detail work is remarkable. When did you have the additions done?" I told her I hadn't. I watched her face cycle through disbelief, concern, and something that might have been fear. She took photographs with her phone, measured the tattoo's dimensions, asked if I was experiencing any pain. I didn't mention the itching, which had become constant, or the whispers, which were growing clearer. She referred me to a specialist in tattoo removal, though we both knew I wasn't trying to remove anything. I was trying to understand what was refusing to stay still. Autumn came early that year, or perhaps the tree brought it with it. On day 12, I woke to find several leaves had faded to yellow and brown, their edges curling as if touched by seasonal change. I pressed my finger against one, and it felt warm, warmer than my skin, as if the ink itself held heat. Outside, the late September morning was humid and green, summer clinging stubbornly to the city. But on my arm, fall had arrived with absolute certainty. The whispers had clarified into something worse. Not words exactly, but emotions. Fear, anger, pleading. They came strongest at night, when the world quieted enough for me to hear what lived beneath my skin. I started sleeping with headphones, blasting white noise loud enough to drown out everything. But volume couldn't block what I felt rather than heard. The vibrations that seemed to travel through bone, the urgency that pressed against the inside of my skull. I found the second forum post on day 15. Different username, ashen memory, same desperate tone. They described a tattoo that grew, that changed, that whispered. They mentioned doing research into the ink source and finding references to a town 3 hours north, to a tree that had stood for 300 years before it burned, to stories of hangings and burnings and bodies left to rot among its roots. The post ended abruptly. "I'm going there tomorrow to see for myself. I need to understand what's been put inside me." There were no follow-up posts. The account had been deleted. My skin started changing on day 18. It began with texture. The area around the tree felt different under my fingers. Rougher, denser, less like flesh and more like something else. I spent an hour in my bathroom running my hands over my forearm, trying to convince myself I was imagining it. But the evidence was undeniable. Where the roots spread, my skin had taken on a grain, subtle but present, like wood beginning to emerge from within. I stopped going to work, called in sick, then stopped calling at all. I couldn't sit in meetings, couldn't focus on screens, couldn't pretend everything was normal while I watched myself transform. The tree had consumed half my forearm now, spreading up past my elbow, sending exploratory roots down across my wrist and onto my hand. Each new branch felt like an invasion, each new leaf like a claim being staked on territory that was supposed to be mine. The whispering became constant. Not loud, never loud, but persistent as tinnitus, always present in the background of my awareness. I caught myself straining to understand, leaning into the sound as if clarity were just beyond reach. Sometimes I thought I heard names. Sometimes I heard dates. Sometimes I heard the crackle of fire and the crack of rope and the screams of people who knew they were dying. On day 23, my hair started falling out. Not all at once. Just a few strands at first, drifting down while I showered, catching on my shoulders while I stared at nothing in particular. But by evening, I was shedding constantly, leaving trails across my apartment like something molting. I gathered handfuls from my pillow, from my clothes, from the sink where they collected in drifts. They didn't feel like hair anymore. They felt lighter, more delicate, papery thin. They felt like leaves. I found the location on day 25. Hours of searching through historical records, archived newspaper articles, local legends transcribed by amateur historians. The town was called Millbrook, population 847, located in a valley that flooded every spring. In 1682, a woman named Elspeth had been hanged from an oak tree for witchcraft. In 1704, 3 more followed. In 1729, 2 men accused of consorting with darkness. The oak kept growing, kept standing witness, kept sinking its roots deeper into soil that had drunk blood and ash and the last breaths of the condemned. In 2019, the tree burned. Lightning strike, the articles said. Completely destroyed, they said. But an enterprising artist had collected the ashes before the town could haul away the remains. She'd been experimenting with organic materials, they said. Creating ink with a history, they said. Giving new life to old wood, they said. The articles didn't mention what happened to the artist. She disappeared from social media, from professional registries, from every digital footprint I could find. Her studio had closed. Her website had gone dark. It was as if she'd never existed, except for the ashes she'd left behind, mixed with carrier oils and preservatives, loaded into a tattoo gun, and pressed permanently into the skin of people who'd been too drunk or too curious or too desperate to ask what they were really agreeing to. My reflections started lying to me on day 28. I'd catch glimpses of myself in windows, in mirrors, in the dark screen of my laptop, and the person looking back wasn't quite right. The proportions were off, the posture too rigid, the eyes too far apart. Once I saw my face in a storefront window and watched my mouth move independently of my intentions, forming words I wasn't speaking. I stopped looking at reflective surfaces. I stopped trying to recognize myself. The bark appeared on day 31, small patches at first, scattered across my forearm where the tree had grown thickest. The skin had hardened, darkened, split into rough plates that didn't hurt but felt profoundly wrong, like my body was being rewritten from the outside in. I picked at one patch and it didn't bleed. Nothing came away. It was attached as thoroughly as real bark to real wood, because some part of me was becoming real wood, and I couldn't pretend otherwise anymore. I drove to Millbrook on day 34. The town looked abandoned even though I saw people moving behind curtained windows, saw cars parked in driveways, saw signs of life everywhere except in direct line of sight. The center of town held a park with a monument, and at the park center, a wide circle of scorched earth where nothing grew. The grass around it was green and healthy, but inside the circle, the ground remained black and barren, as if the fire had burned so hot it had sterilized the soil permanently. I stood at the circle's edge and felt the tree pulse. The sensation was unmistakable, a rhythm that matched my heartbeat, but originated from my arm, from the branches that now reached my shoulder, from the roots that had wrapped around my fingers like rings. The whispers rose to a crescendo, no longer words but pure sound. Voices layered on voices, decades of accusation and denial and final terror compressed into a single ongoing scream that existed just below human hearing. Something had been trapped in the tree. Something had burned with it. Something had survived in the ashes and was now growing again, using my body as soil, using my life as water, using my consciousness as sunlight. The tree wasn't haunted. The tree was the haunting, and I was becoming the tree. A woman approached from across the park. She moved stiffly, dressed in clothes that seemed slightly wrong for the season, carrying herself with the careful deliberation of someone whose body no longer quite obeyed standard human commands. When she got close enough, I saw the bark patches on her neck, saw the way her hair fell like autumn leaves, saw the tree that covered her entire left arm and half her chest. She didn't speak. Neither did I. We recognized each other the way trees in a forest recognize their neighbors, through root systems, through chemical signals, through connections that existed below the surface of visible reality. She'd been here longer, much longer. The tree had nearly finished claiming her. Soon she'd stop moving. Soon she'd root herself in soil. Soon she'd stand where the oak once stood, waiting for the next burning, for the next transformation, for the cycle to continue. I should have run. I should have driven back to the city, should have found a doctor, should have cut the infection out before it spread further. But I knew none of that would work. The tree wasn't in my arm anymore. The tree was in my blood, in my bones, in the deepest parts of what made me alive. Removing it would mean removing myself, and I wasn't sure there was enough of myself left to remove. The woman turned and walked toward the scorched circle. I watched her step across the boundary, onto the dead earth, and stand perfectly still. The wind moved through the park, rustling leaves and surrounding trees, but she didn't sway. She stood rooted, finally home. I should have left then. I didn't. Instead, I rolled up my sleeve and looked at what I'd become. The tree covered my arm completely now, bark spreading across my shoulder, roots curling around my ribs. I could feel it reaching deeper, could feel new growth pushing through my sternum, seeking my heart. The whispers had stopped. In their place was something worse, a knowing, a certainty, an understanding that I'd been chosen not randomly, but specifically, deliberately, by forces that needed bodies to remember what had been lost. The itching had stopped too. Everything had stopped except the growing. I walked to my car, started the engine, drove home through darkness that felt deeper than it should, past landscapes that seemed to shift when I wasn't looking directly at them, through a reality that had become negotiable in ways I'd never imagined possible. In my rearview mirror, I thought I saw the woman still standing in the circle, but I also thought I saw an oak tree, and I also thought I saw nothing at all. My apartment felt foreign. I moved through rooms I'd lived in for years and recognized nothing. Or perhaps I recognized everything too well, saw it all from a perspective that was no longer entirely human, no longer entirely singular. The tree had opinions about shelter, about light, about depth and reaching and the slow, patient work of growing from seed to sapling, to something that outlasted generations. I stood at my window and looked out at the city lights. Somewhere out there, other people were waking up with unexplained tattoos. Somewhere out there, other artists were mixing ashes with ink, creating carriers for things that refused to stay dead. Somewhere out there, trees were burning and preparing to burn again, and the cycle was continuing because cycles always continued, because that's what made them cycles, because beginning and ending were human concepts, and the tree had never been human. My reflection in the dark window showed me as I was, half man, half wood, neither and both, something caught in transformation with no clear endpoint. The person looking back had my face but wore it differently, as if my features were now a costume draped over something that had outgrown the need for faces. I raised my arm and watched the tree move with me, branches swaying even though I stood in a closed room with no breeze. Leaves rustled with a sound like whispered names. Roots flexed with the patience of something that measured time in decades rather than days. I should be terrified. I should be fighting this. Instead, I feel curious about what comes next, about what it means to root and reach and remember things I've never experienced. The tree has memories, and those memories are becoming mine, and soon I won't be able to tell where I end and it begins, if such a distinction ever truly existed. Outside my window, autumn is finally beginning, right on schedule. The leaves are just starting to turn. Soon they'll fall, and winter will come, and I'll stand here watching the season change, feeling my own leaves curl and brown and drift away, feeling the cold settle into my bark, feeling dormancy approach like sleep. And in spring, I'll bloom again. I'm sure of it. Story 8. The doll arrived 3 days after the funeral, wrapped in yellowed tissue paper that crumbled at my wife's touch. I watched from the doorway as she unwrapped it on our kitchen table, the afternoon light cutting sharp angles across the porcelain face. The doll was perhaps 2 feet tall, dressed in what might have once been an elaborate Victorian gown, now faded to the color of old bone. Its glass eyes caught the light with an unsettling clarity, seeming to track my wife's movements as she lifted it from its wrappings. My wife, I'll call her V, as she preferred in her journals, held the thing with a reverence I hadn't seen since her grandmother's final days. A letter accompanied the package, written in the trembling hand of a woman who knew she was dying. The message was brief. Keep her close. Never let her go. She's been in our family for 5 generations, and she must stay with you now. Promise me. I remember thinking it was a strange bequest. Her grandmother had been a practical woman, unsentimental about possessions. Yet here was this doll, arriving with the weight of a sacred obligation. V set the doll on the mantel in our living room, positioning it between old photographs and a clock that had belonged to her father. I suggested we might store it somewhere less prominent. Our living room was small, and the doll's glassy stare dominated the space. But V insisted. She had promised. The doll would stay where she could see it. The first change I noticed was so subtle I convinced myself I'd imagined it. This was perhaps 2 weeks after the doll's arrival. I was reading on the couch when I glanced up at the mantel and noticed what appeared to be a fine crack near the doll's left eye, a hairline fracture that hadn't been there before. Porcelain was fragile, I told myself. Old things deteriorated. It was nothing. But then there were the other changes. The doll's auburn hair, which had been lustrous despite its age, began to look dull, strands of gray appearing at the temples. The dress, already faded, developed small tears along the hem. Most disturbing were the hands. Those tiny porcelain hands that had been smooth and unblemished now showed the faint tracery of what could only be described as veins beneath the surface, like watermarks in old paper. I mentioned these observations to V one evening as we prepared dinner. She was chopping vegetables with unusual concentration, her knife moving in sharp, rhythmic strikes against the cutting board. When I spoke, she paused, knife suspended in midair, and looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. After a long moment, she said she'd noticed the same things. Then she returned to her chopping, and the conversation died there, smothered by the sound of steel against wood. What I didn't mention, what I couldn't quite bring myself to voice, was that V herself seemed different. Nothing dramatic, nothing I could point to with certainty. But there were moments when I'd catch her reflection in a mirror or see her silhouette against a window, and something about her seemed diminished, as though she were being slowly erased at the edges. She moved more carefully, as if her joints ached. She slept longer. Dark circles appeared beneath her eyes, stubborn shadows that makeup couldn't quite conceal. I told myself I was being paranoid. We were both grieving. Grief aged people. It was natural. The night everything shifted, V couldn't sleep. I woke to find her standing in the living room at 3 a.m, staring at the doll on the mantel. The only light came from the street lamp outside, casting long shadows that seemed to reach across the floor like fingers. I approached slowly, my bare feet silent on the hardwood, and asked if she was all right. She didn't turn to look at me. She just kept staring at that porcelain face, and in a voice barely above a whisper, she told me the doll looked older. I moved closer, squinting in the dim light. She was right. The changes I'd noticed before had accelerated. The hair was now more gray than auburn. The skin, if porcelain could be called skin, showed distinct wrinkles around the eyes and mouth. The hands were gnarled, fingers slightly curled as if with arthritis. It was impossible, grotesque, a violation of material reality that made my stomach tighten with instinctive revulsion. V explained that she'd been researching her family history, going through boxes of old letters and photographs her grandmother had left her. She'd found references to the doll going back over a century. Every woman in her maternal line had inherited it, and everyone had written about it with a mixture of duty and dread. The letters spoke of a burden passed down, a responsibility that couldn't be shirked. One letter, written by her great-great-grandmother in 1897, described trying to donate the doll to a church charity. She died 4 days later. The cause of death was listed as extreme senescence. She aged decades in less than a week, her body simply giving out as if time itself had accelerated within her. There were other stories. An aunt who'd locked the doll in a trunk in her attic. She lasted 6 days before her family found her, aged beyond recognition. A cousin who'd tried to burn it. The fire wouldn't take. The doll sat unscathed in the flames, and the cousin was found 3 days later, her hair white, her skin like parchment, barely able to speak through teeth that had loosened and fallen from her gums. The pattern was always the same. Separation brought rapid aging. Death followed inevitably. I wanted to call it superstition, family mythology grown distorted over generations. But I was looking at a porcelain doll that was aging, that had developed wrinkles and gray hair, that showed signs of physical deterioration No inanimate object should display, and I was looking at my wife, who seemed to be fading before my eyes, who moved like a woman decades older than her 34 years. The rational part of my mind screamed that this was impossible. Dolls didn't age. They didn't steal life force or years or whatever metaphysical concept we were dancing around. But the rational part of my mind was growing quieter, drowned out by the evidence accumulating on our mantle and in the drawn lines of V's face. I suggested we consult someone, a historian, an anthropologist, someone who might understand what we were dealing with. V looked at me with eyes that seemed older than they'd been that morning, and reminded me of what happened to the women who'd tried to separate from the doll. We couldn't risk it. The doll had to stay. But I couldn't accept that. I couldn't watch my wife deteriorate while a piece of painted porcelain grew ancient on our mantle. There had to be a way to break whatever connection existed between them. I began my own research, diving into obscure corners of the internet, reading about cursed objects and sympathetic magic, about things that shouldn't exist but persisted in the stories humans told themselves in the dark. I found references to similar objects, a mirror that reflected the owner's death, a painting that aged instead of its subject, a ring that transferred the wearer's wounds to itself. Objects of transference, they were called, items that bore burdens meant for living flesh. The theory was that they were created through trauma, through desperate acts by people who would do anything to escape time's grip. Someone, at some point in V's family history, had made a bargain. The doll would age, so its owner wouldn't have to. But the bargain was imperfect. The doll didn't absorb time, it hoarded it. It took years and accumulated them, growing older and older, and when its owner tried to escape, all those accumulated years came due at once, crashing down on whoever dared to break the bond. The doll on our mantle was ancient now. Its face was a map of wrinkles, its hair white and thin, its body hunched. It looked like it should have crumbled to dust centuries ago, yet it persisted, held together by something that had nothing to do with physics or chemistry. V was changing too. Her hair showed streaks of gray I knew hadn't been there a month ago. Her hands trembled when she poured her morning coffee. She complained of joint pain, of fatigue that sleep couldn't touch. She was 34 years old, and she was aging at a pace that terrified me. I made a decision. Whether it was brave or foolish, I still don't know, but I couldn't stand by and watch. I waited until V was asleep one night, her breathing shallow and labored in a way that made my chest ache. I took the doll from the mantle, wrapped it in a canvas bag, and drove to the river 20 miles from our home. The plan was simple. Throw it in the deepest part I could find. Let the current carry it away, sever whatever connection bound it to my wife. The doll felt heavier than it should have as I stood on the bridge, the dark water rushing below. I could hear the whisper of current over stone, could smell the mineral tang of the river in the cold air. I lifted the bag, preparing to throw it over the railing. That's when I felt the weight shift. Not in the bag, in myself. A sudden vertigo, as if the ground had tilted beneath my feet. My hands, gripping the canvas, looked different in the streetlight's amber glow. The skin seemed looser, the veins more prominent. I looked down at my reflection in a puddle at my feet and saw a stranger staring back, a man with gray at his temples, with lines around his eyes that had deepened into crevasses. I dropped the bag. The doll tumbled out onto the sidewalk, and I swear, though I know how this sounds, I swear it smiled. Its withered porcelain face tilted upward, glass eyes reflecting the streetlight, and the corner of its mouth seemed to curve in satisfaction. I drove home in a daze, the doll sitting in the passenger seat. My hands on the steering wheel looked like my father's hands had looked before he died. When I stumbled through our front door, V was awake, standing in the living room, and she looked younger than she had in weeks. The gray had receded from her hair. The shadows beneath her eyes had faded. She looked at me with something that might have been horror, or might have been relief. I put the doll back on the mantle. I had no choice. My reflection in the hall mirror showed a man I barely recognized, aged decades in the span of an hour. V helped me to the couch, her touch gentle but distant, as if she were caring for an elderly relative rather than her husband. The doll sits on the mantel still. Sometimes I think I see it watching me, but I try not to look directly at it anymore. V has returned to herself. Vibrant, healthy, moving with the easy grace of someone in their 30s. She doesn't talk about that night, and neither do I. What would be the point? But I've been doing my own research now, different research. I've been tracing the doll's history backward, trying to find where it began. The records are fragmentary, documents lost to time and fire and simple neglect. But I found something that keeps me awake at night, staring at the ceiling while V sleeps peacefully beside me. The doll didn't enter V's family 5 generations ago. It's been there longer, much longer. The first reference I can find is from 1823, but the description suggests it was already old then, already showing signs of age. There are hints of it in letters from the 1700s, whispers in documents that crumble when I try to photograph them. And if I'm reading the fragmented records correctly, the doll hasn't passed only through the women in V's family. There have been men too. Husbands, brothers, sons. All of them tried to protect the women they loved. All of them touched the doll, held it, attempted to take it away. All of them aged. I look at my hands as I write this, at the liver spots and prominent veins, at skin that seems thinner each day. I'm 42 years old, but I look 70. V is healthy, thriving even. The doll sits on our mantel, and I can't tell anymore how much of its age is stolen from V and how much is stolen from me. The worst part is the uncertainty. On my clearer days, I wonder if any of this is real. Dolls don't age. Objects don't steal time. Perhaps I'm ill, my mind deteriorating along with my body, constructing elaborate delusions to explain the normal progression of some disease the doctors haven't yet diagnosed. Perhaps V is fine because there was never anything wrong with her in the first place, and I'm the only one falling apart, my paranoia growing as my body fails. But then I look at the mantel. I look at that ancient porcelain face, those glass eyes that sometimes seem to shift and track movement across the room. I see the wrinkles that shouldn't exist, the gray hair on a doll that was auburn a few months ago, the curled fingers that look arthritic. I see all this, and I know something is happening, even if I can't fully understand what. V has started keeping a journal. I found it last week, hidden in her nightstand. The entries are brief, clinical observations. She notes the changes in the doll, the changes in me, the curious stability of her own condition. She writes about the family history, about the weight of inheritance, about burdens that can't be set down without consequence. And in the final entry, dated just yesterday, she wrote something that makes me question everything I think I know. Sometimes I wonder if he sees the same doll I see. Sometimes I wonder if we're even in the same room. I don't know what that means. I don't know what any of this means anymore. All I know is that the doll is still on the mantel, V is still healthy, and I am still aging, faster than I should, my body keeping time to a clock that runs too fast, or maybe, to no clock at all. Tonight, as V sleeps and I sit in the dark living room, I realize the most terrifying possibility of all. Perhaps the doll isn't stealing anything. Perhaps it's just reflecting what was already there. Perhaps we're all aging at the rate we deserve, and the only question that matters is whose reflection you're looking at, your own or something else's. The doll sits on the mantel, ancient and patient, and I sit here, wondering which one of us is really growing older, and whether that distinction even matters anymore. Story 9. The pocket watch arrived on a Tuesday, wrapped in oil-stained velvet that smelled of tobacco and something sweeter, almost medicinal. My workshop, tucked above a bookstore on Ashford Street, had seen countless timepieces pass through its doors, but this one made my fingers hesitate before touching it. The sensation passed quickly. I attributed it to the October chill seeping through the window panes. Victorian craftsmanship, exquisite even beneath decades of neglect. The case was sterling silver, tarnished to the color of storm clouds, with an engraving I couldn't quite decipher. Serpentine letters that seemed to shift when I tilted it toward the lamp. The crystal was spiderwebbed with cracks, and when I finally opened it, the mechanism inside defied everything I understood about horology. There were the standard elements, the balance wheel, the escapement, the mainspring barrel, but also additional gears that seemed to serve no mechanical purpose. They were arranged in a pattern that reminded me of something organic, like the chambers of a heart or the spiral of a nautilus shell. The watch had stopped at what appeared to be 3 days, 1 hour, and 16 minutes. Not a time of day, just duration. I spent that first evening cleaning it, my loop pressed against my eye socket until it ached. The metal was warm under my fingertips, warmer than room temperature should allow. I told myself it was just absorbed heat from my hands, from the desk lamp bent close over my work. The rational mind constructs such comfortable lies. By midnight, I had it running again. The second hand swept smoothly around the unmarked face, because that's what I realized as the hours passed. There were no numerals, no indicators of hours or minutes. Just 3 hands moving in their eternal circle, and that strange warmth that seemed to pulse in rhythm with the ticking. I should have left it alone. Should have wound it, set it in its box, and returned it to the estate lawyer who'd commissioned the repair. Instead, I held it, felt that warmth spread up my wrist like a living thing, and watched the longest hand shudder and reset itself. 72 hours, 3 days. The watch face seemed to glow faintly in the darkness of my workshop, and I understood with a certainty that bypassed logic entirely. It wasn't measuring the time of day. It was measuring something far more intimate. The thought was ridiculous, insane. Yet I couldn't release the watch, couldn't stop staring at those hands as they began their countdown. My countdown. I could feel it in my bones, in the hollow spaces between my ribs, in the rhythm of my own pulse, suddenly gone irregular and strange. 72 hours of life remaining. I didn't sleep that night, or the next. The watch lay on my workbench, and I sat across from it like we were engaged in some kind of negotiation. Every few minutes I'd check, compulsively, obsessively, and watch the time decrease with mechanical precision. When doubt crept in, when I tried to convince myself this was exhaustion or stress or the early stages of some neurological condition, I would feel that warmth again, spreading from the watch through the air itself, confirming what I desperately wanted to dismiss as delusion. On the second day, I tested it. There was a rat in the walls, one I'd heard scratching for weeks but never managed to catch. I lured it with cheese and patience, cornered it behind the bookshelf, and held the watch near its small, trembling body. The hands spun backward, then forward, settling at a different time. The rat went still, not dead. I could see its chest moving, but changed somehow, diminished. When I released it, it moved with the slowness of something ancient, dragging itself back into the darkness. The watch now showed 73 hours and 47 minutes. I should have felt horror, should have thrown the thing into the street, should have run. Instead, I felt a terrible elation, a hunger that made my hands shake as I reached for the watch again. The mechanism wasn't just measuring time, it was storing it, transferring it. The additional gears I'd noticed during the repair, those organic-looking chambers, weren't decorative. They were reservoirs. The knowledge came without source or reason, planted directly into my consciousness like a seed that had always been waiting to germinate. All I needed was contact, skin to skin. The watch would do the rest, drawing time from one vessel and filling another. A perfect transaction, elegant in its brutality. I found myself at the window, watching people pass on the street below. The evening crowd, workers heading home, their lives stretching ahead of them in decades they took for granted. My throat was dry. My heart hammered against my sternum hard enough to hurt. The watch pulsed in my pocket, keeping rhythm, encouraging. How easy it would be. A brush in a crowded subway, a handshake, just a touch, and years could flow from them into me. They'd never know what they'd lost, would never connect a sudden fatigue or a gray hair to that momentary contact with a stranger. And I would live, would continue the work I'd only begun, would see another sunrise, another season. The thought terrified me, but not enough. I left the workshop that night with the watch clutched tight in my jacket pocket. The October air bit at my exposed skin, and I welcomed the cold as a form of penance for what I was about to become. The subway station was 3 blocks away, and with each step, I felt myself separating from some essential humanity, the part that makes us hesitate before crossing certain lines. The platform was crowded, bodies pressed together in the familiar dance of urban proximity, everyone careful to maintain the illusion of isolation despite the forced intimacy. I found a spot near the tunnel entrance, where the rush of approaching trains would mask any sound, where the press of boarding passengers would make contact inevitable. My hand emerged from my pocket, the watch concealed in my palm. The silver was fever-hot now, almost painful to hold. Around me, lives continued in their ordinary trajectories. A woman arguing into her phone, a man reviewing spreadsheets on his tablet, students laughing about something I couldn't hear over the approaching train. Each one a reservoir of time, of moments I could steal and hoard and use to purchase my continued existence. The train arrived in a scream of metal and rushing air. Bodies surged forward. I raised my hand, positioned it where contact would be unavoidable, where the transfer could happen in the chaos of boarding, and couldn't do it. My hand fell back to my side. The watch burned against my palm, and I felt something almost like rage emanating from it, a fury at my hesitation. The crowd flowed around me, boarding and departing, none of them aware how close they'd come to something monstrous. I stood frozen on the platform as the train pulled away, leaving me alone with my cowardice or my conscience. I wasn't sure which. The walk back to the workshop was longer than I remembered. The watch felt heavier with each block, its weight increasing until my entire arm ached with the burden of carrying it. When I finally climbed the stairs and locked the door behind me, I had 61 hours remaining. I'd wasted 11 hours in deliberation, and the watch seemed to punish me for it. That night, it started making sounds. Not just the standard ticking, but something underneath. A whisper that might have been mechanical friction, or might have been something else entirely. Words that I couldn't quite distinguish. A language comprised of clicking gears and sliding springs. I tried to ignore it, threw a cloth over the watch, locked it in a drawer. But the sounds followed me into sleep, into dreams where I stood in vast clockwork cathedrals while the walls counted down the seconds of my life. I woke to find the watch on my nightstand, though I distinctly remembered leaving it locked away. The cloth was folded neatly beside it. 60 hours. The next day I tried to work on other repairs, tried to lose myself in the familiar rituals of maintenance and restoration, but my hands wouldn't cooperate. Trembling so badly I dropped a hairspring and spent 20 minutes searching for it on the floor. Each time I looked up, the pocket watch was in my line of sight, positioned as if by accident but somehow always visible, always reminding me of the countdown. When clients came to collect their repairs, I found myself studying them with a kind of hunger that frightened me. The young man picking up his grandmother's wristwatch. He had decades ahead of him. I could almost see them radiating from his skin like heat shimmer. The elderly woman collecting her husband's railroad chronometer. Her time was shorter but still more than mine, still precious. Each one a potential transaction, each one a way to continue existing. The temptation was a physical thing now, a pressure behind my eyes, a taste like copper on my tongue. The watch encouraged it, I was certain. When people got close, it would pulse harder, warming my skin, whispering in that gear-clicking language about how simple it would be, how justified. By the 50-hour mark, I'd stopped pretending to work. I sat in my chair with the watch in my lap, studying it for any hint of how to satisfy it without becoming the monster it wanted me to be. The additional gears, those organic chambers, were fuller now than when I'd first opened the mechanism. The rat's time, stored and waiting. Such a small amount, barely noticeable in the grand scheme, but the watch had held on to it, was holding it still, offering it as proof of concept. I could feel those stolen moments inside the mechanism, could almost taste the rat's small, frantic life. And beneath that, something older. Residue of previous transfers, countless transactions stretching back through decades or centuries. The watch had done this before, many times. I was not its first keeper, merely its latest collaborator. The realization should have broken the spell, should have forced me to destroy the thing, smash it against the wall until nothing remained but springs and splinters. Instead, I found myself wondering about those previous keepers. How long had they lasted? How many had found the strength to resist? And how many had surrendered to the hunger the watch cultivated in their chests? At 48 hours, I stopped eating. The watch was sustenance enough, its warmth flowing into me in waves that felt almost like nourishment. My body understood what my mind still resisted. Conventional needs were becoming obsolete. I was transforming into something that existed outside the normal rules, something that could persist beyond the boundary the watch had shown me, if only I was willing to pay the price it demanded. The workshop took on a strange quality as my time dwindled. Colors seemed more vivid, sounds more distinct. I could hear conversations from the street below with perfect clarity, could distinguish individual heartbeats when people passed beneath my window. The watch was sharpening my senses, preparing me for the hunt it knew was inevitable, making me more efficient at what I would need to become. At 36 hours, I started seeing them. Other keepers, shadows in the periphery of my vision, gone when I turned to look directly. They stood in corners, sat at the edges of my workbench, waited by the door. Some were translucent, barely there. Others seemed almost solid, their faces twisted by whatever compromises they'd made, their eyes reflecting a hunger that never quite satisfied. They watched me with what might have been pity, or might have been anticipation. I tried to speak to them, ask them how they'd managed, what choice they'd made. They never answered with words, only pointed to the watch, then to the door, then back to the watch again. The cycle was clear. Time runs out. Feed the mechanism. Time is restored. Repeat until the corruption becomes complete, until the keeper is no longer a person but a function of the watch itself, an extension of its hunger. 24 hours. One day, the shadows multiplied, filling my workshop until I could barely move without passing through one of them. They were more real now, or I was less real. The boundary between us was dissolving. Some reached for me with hands that felt like ice, touching my shoulders, my face, examining me the way I'd examined the watch when it first arrived, assessing my potential, calculating how long I'd last. The watch had stopped making sounds. It sat silent and perfect on my workbench, its hands showing my dwindling time with mechanical indifference. But the silence was worse than the whispers, because now I could hear my own thoughts too clearly, could track the evolution of my hunger with perfect clarity. I wanted to live. The desire was fundamental, stripped of all pretense or rationality. I wanted to continue existing, and the watch offered a way, and the only thing preventing me from taking it was a moral framework that seemed increasingly abstract compared to the concrete reality of my approaching end. 12 hours. Half a day. I dressed in my best clothes, though I couldn't articulate why. Some instinct towards ceremony, perhaps, or simply a desire to be presentable for whatever came next. The shadows had gone quiet, watching, waiting. The watch rested in my vest pocket, over my heart, counting down. I stood at the window as evening fell, watching the city light up against the darkness. So many lives down there, burning through time without recognizing its value. They'd never held their remaining days in the palm of their hand, never felt the weight of mortality made tangible and precise. They were wasteful, careless with the gift I desperately needed. My hand found the watch without conscious decision. The metal had cooled, or I had grown used to its heat. Either way, the sensation was familiar now, almost comforting. I could feel the mechanism inside, the stored time, the potential for transfer. All it required was contact and will. The watch would handle the rest, drawing out years like drawing breath, filling my depleted reservoir until I could continue. The temptation was complete, perfect, all-consuming. I opened the window. Cold air rushed in, carrying the sounds of the city. Traffic, voices, the distant wail of a siren. Below, People continued their evening rituals, unaware of the predator considering them from above. The watch pulsed once, twice, a rhythm that matched my heartbeat, or perhaps dictated it. 6 hours remaining. Enough time to reach the street, to find someone alone, to make contact and survive. Or enough time to wait, to let the countdown complete, to discover what the watch had been hiding from me all along. Because I'd realized something in those final hours, watching the shadows of previous keepers, none of them had escaped. The ones who'd fed the watch were still here, trapped in some way I didn't fully understand. And the ones who'd resisted. I looked down at the watch face. 5 hours and 53 minutes. The hands moved with absolute precision, measuring out my remaining moments with mechanical perfection. But I noticed something I'd missed before, or perhaps something that had only become visible now, in these final hours. Behind the primary hands, almost invisible against the unmarked face, was another set of indicators. Dozens of them, hundreds perhaps, each one moving at a different speed, each one measuring a different life. The watch wasn't holding stolen time in those organic chambers. It was holding the people themselves, or whatever remained of them after the transfer was complete. The rat was still in there. I could feel it now, sense its small consciousness moving in endless circles inside the mechanism. And the others, all the others, everyone who'd ever touched the watch with intent to take or been touched by a keeper with intent to steal. They were all still present, all still aware, trapped in a mechanism that never stopped, never rested, never released what it had consumed. The watch didn't transfer time. It consumed it, ate it whole and kept it, and any keeper who used it became part of the collection eventually. Just another hand moving in mindless circles, measuring and marking and maintaining the hunger that could never be satisfied. 4 hours. I understood the choice now. Feed the watch and become its prisoner, trapped in the mechanism forever, or refuse and simply end. The shadows knew this. They'd all faced the same decision, and some had chosen one way, some the other, and all of them remained here, bound to the watch through their moment of crisis. 3 hours. My hands were steady as I moved to my workbench and selected my tools, the smallest screwdriver, the finest tweezers, the magnifying loop. If the watch was a prison, then somewhere in its mechanism was a lock, and I was, after all, a watchmaker. 2 hours. The watch resisted. As I opened the case and began dismantling the movement, I felt resistance like I'd never encountered in any timepiece. The gears didn't want to separate. The springs fought my tweezers. The whole mechanism seemed to contract, pulling itself tighter, protecting its secrets. But I persisted, removing each component with care, laying them out in precise order on my workbench. 1 hour. The organic chambers were the key. Up close I could see they weren't metal at all, but something else. Something that had grown over the original mechanism like a parasite, transforming the innocent Victorian timepiece into something altogether darker. Inside each chamber, a light flickered. Lives reduced to luminescence. Consciousness compressed to fit in spaces meant for springs and jewels. 30 minutes. I had a choice to make. Destroy the watch completely, scatter its parts, perhaps finally kill it and all the consciousness it contained. Or repair it properly, restore it to what it had been before the growth, before the corruption. Remove the parasite and free what it had captured. 15 minutes. My hands moved with a precision I'd never achieved before, perhaps because I had nothing left to lose. The watch couldn't threaten me anymore, couldn't tempt me with survival, because I'd chosen my path. I was going to die, had already accepted it, but I could choose what that death meant. 5 minutes. The final chamber opened. Light flooded my workshop, not bright but pervasive, filling every corner, illuminating the shadows that had haunted me. They stepped forward, becoming solid, becoming real. Not ghosts, but prisoners, finally seeing their chance at freedom. 1 minute. I removed the last piece of the organic growth and felt it die in my fingers, felt it release its hold on the mechanism and on the lives it had consumed. The watch stopped entirely, all its hands falling still. The light dimmed. The shadows began to fade, not into darkness, but into something else. Into morning, perhaps, or into rest. 30 seconds. The elderly woman from the estate lawyer's office appeared in my workshop. She looked confused, disoriented, as if waking from a long sleep. She'd been the watch's previous victim, I realized. The one who'd tested it and been caught. Her remaining time stolen by the mechanism. The lawyer had no idea, had thought she'd simply passed peacefully, had brought her effects to be catalogued, including one Victorian pocket watch that perhaps should have stayed buried with her. 10 seconds. She reached for me, her hand passing through mine like smoke. But I felt it nonetheless. Felt her gratitude or her pity or her warning, or the watch was dead, the curse broken, the prison opened. But I'd waited too long, had spent my remaining hours on the repair instead of the escape. 3 seconds. I looked at my workbench, at the scattered components of the watch laid out in perfect order. In death, it looked innocent again, just metal and crystal and springs. No one would know what it had been, what it had done, and perhaps that was for the best. Let it remain a mystery, a curious Victorian timepiece with an unusual mechanism. Nothing more. 1 second. The strangest thing happened then, in that final moment. Time didn't stop. It stretched, expanded, unfurled like a ribbon in water. The second hand on the wall clock slowed to near immobility, and in that extended instant, I understood that the watch had been lying all along. About the transfer mechanism, about the time remaining, about everything. It hadn't been measuring my remaining life. It had been measuring how long until it could consume me completely. And now, with the watch destroyed and my final second extended into something like eternity, I had a choice I hadn't expected. Stay in this moment forever, trapped as the others had been, but conscious, aware, present, or step forward into whatever came next, uncertain and afraid, but free. The workshop around me held its breath. The scattered watch parts gleamed in the lamplight. The elderly woman waited by the door, 1 foot in my world, 1 foot in whatever lay beyond. I thought of the rat, limping away into darkness, diminished but alive, changed but free. Time resumed. The wall clock ticked. The lamplight flickered. And I'm still sitting here, at my workbench, writing this account. The wall clock reads 3 past midnight. The pocket watch components remain exactly as I left them, undisturbed by the passage of hours or days or weeks. I have no appetite, no fatigue, no need for anything except to maintain this vigil, this watch over the watch. Sometimes I think I imagined everything. The countdown, the temptation, the revelation. The watch lies disassembled before me, innocent and inert. I could rebuild it. My hands know the movements, understand the mechanism. It would take perhaps an hour to restore it to functionality, to wind it and set it running again. But I don't. I sit here, and I wait, and I watch the components in case they show any sign of reassembling themselves, in case the organic chambers begin to grow again, in case the hunger wasn't destroyed but merely sleeping. The estate lawyer never came back for the watch. I've checked the records. There was no lawyer, no estate, no delivery. The watch simply appeared, as if it had always been here, waiting for someone like me to find it. And now I wait, trapped in an eternal moment of decision, unable to rebuild the watch or destroy it completely, unable to leave my workshop or do anything except maintain this frozen second, where I neither lived nor died, but simply hesitated, caught in the mechanism's final trick. The shadows visit sometimes. They sit with me, companionable in their silence. They know what I've discovered, what I still refuse to admit. The watch wasn't measuring my time at all. It was creating it. Every second I spent worrying about the countdown was a second I wouldn't have had otherwise. A gift and a curse wrapped in Victorian silver, offering infinite time to anyone too afraid of death to simply live. I understand now. I think I've always understood. But understanding changes nothing. The wall clock ticks. The watch parts gleam. The shadows wait. And I sit here, in my workshop above the bookstore on Ashford Street, eternally repairing what cannot be fixed, eternally breaking what refuses to stay broken, eternally trapped in the second between life and whatever comes after. Still here, still watching, still waiting to discover if any of this is real. Story 10. The first time I saw one of them, I thought exhaustion had finally broken something fundamental in my mind. It was 3 in the morning when old Nathaniel appeared in the town square, standing beneath the oak tree where he'd proposed to his wife 60 years ago. I was driving home from the clinic, my headlights catching his silhouette, solid, undeniable, wearing the same flannel shirt he'd been buried in 2 weeks prior. I slammed the brakes so hard my medical bag spilled across the passenger seat, pill bottles rolling everywhere. He didn't look at me. His eyes were fixed on the tree branches above, mouth moving in what might have been prayer or conversation. For exactly 15 minutes he stood there while I sat frozen in my car, hands trembling on the steering wheel, telling myself this was a hallucination brought on by 60-hour work weeks and too much coffee. Then, between one blink and the next, he simply wasn't there anymore. No fade, no theatrical vanishing, just absence where presence had been. I didn't tell anyone. What would I say? That I'd seen a dead man standing under a tree? That I'd timed it, watching my dashboard clock tick through 15 impossible minutes? They'd suggest I take time off, maybe refer me to a colleague 2 towns over who specialized in physician burnout. But then it happened to the Abbotts. Evelyn came to my clinic 3 days later, moving like someone sleepwalking through their own life. She sat in my examination room and told me her husband had appeared in their kitchen, standing by the stove where he'd cooked breakfast every Sunday morning for 38 years. She'd watched him for 15 minutes, too terrified to speak, to move, to breathe. He'd looked at her only once, and she said his eyes held something terrible, not malice, but a crushing, infinite weariness that made her chest tighten just remembering it. He'd opened his mouth, she said, and told her he was trapped, that he was dying over and over again, the same moment repeated eternally, that every time he managed to claw his way back to the world, it pulled something from her, some essential energy she couldn't afford to lose. Then he was gone, and Evelyn had collapsed on her kitchen floor, waking hours later to find bruises on her arms in the shape of fingerprints. Though no one had touched her, I examined her carefully, noting the dark circles under her eyes, the tremor in her hands, the way her pulse felt somehow diminished, as if her very life force had been partially drained away. Her blood pressure was dangerously low. Her reflexes were sluggish. Every marker suggested someone in the late stages of severe illness, yet 3 weeks ago she'd been perfectly healthy. That's when others started coming forward. The pattern emerged slowly, reluctantly, whispered in my examination room and at the grocery store and in the church basement that served as our informal community center. The dead were returning. Not all of them, but enough. Always to the places they'd loved most. Always for exactly 15 minutes, and always with the same message. They were suffering, trapped in an endless loop of their final moments, and somehow our grief, our desperate need to see them again, was feeding something. I started sleeping poorly. Every creak in my old house became a potential visitation. Every shadow seemed to hold the outline of someone I'd once known. My hands developed a tremor that made suturing difficult. I'd catch myself staring at the clock, counting minutes, wondering if any 15-minute span would be the one when someone appeared in my kitchen or beside my bed. The exhaustion spreading through town was palpable. People moved through their days with the glazed expressions of the chronically sleep-deprived, jumping at unexpected sounds, losing weight, aging visibly. The phenomenon was draining us, individually and collectively, and I couldn't explain it with any medical framework I knew. That's when I started investigating. I'm not sure what drove me: professional curiosity, personal fear, or something else entirely. Maybe I needed to believe there was a rational explanation, something concrete I could diagnose and treat. I started spending my evenings in the town archives, poring over old records, looking for patterns, for precedent, for anything that might explain what was happening. The cemetery became my focus. Every person who'd returned had been buried there, in that plot of land on the hill overlooking town. I'd driven past it hundreds of times without really seeing it, but now I couldn't stop thinking about it. The archives showed something interesting. The cemetery was old, much older than the town itself. There were stones dating back centuries, to a settlement that had existed here long before we arrived with our neat houses and paved roads. And there were gaps in the records, periods where no one was buried there for years at a time, followed by sudden clusters of interments. I traced the patterns back and found stories, oral histories recorded by the town's founder, about a period when the settlement had nearly collapsed. People had become listless, drained of vitality, dying of no discernible cause. The cemetery had been abandoned for a generation. I should have stopped there, should have brought this to the town council, to the police, to anyone with authority. But something compelled me forward, a mounting dread mixed with horrible fascination. I went to the cemetery at midnight on a Tuesday, telling myself I just needed to see it, to walk the grounds and confirm there was nothing unusual. The autumn air was cold enough to see my breath, and the gate, which should have been locked, swung open at my touch with a sound like a sigh. The graves stretched before me in uneven rows, some stones ancient and weathered, others recent and stark in their newness. I walked between them with my flashlight, looking for, what? Evidence of disturbance? Signs of ritual activity? I didn't know, but I felt drawn forward, deeper into the cemetery, past the newer sections toward the oldest graves. That's where I found them. Symbols, carved into the bases of the oldest stones, worn nearly smooth by time but still visible if you knew where to look. They reminded me of Celtic knots, but wrong somehow, twisted into configurations that hurt to focus on. And in the center of the oldest section, there was a stone marker unlike the others, flat to the ground, covered in moss and dead leaves, inscribed with symbols that seemed to writhe in my flashlight beam. I knelt beside it, brushing away the debris, and felt something shift in the air around me. The temperature dropped precipitously. My breath came out in thick clouds, and I heard it, a sound like breathing, but vast, coming from everywhere and nowhere, rhythmic as a heartbeat. The symbols on the stone were glowing faintly, pulsing in time with that terrible breathing. I scrambled backward, dropping my flashlight, and in the darkness I saw them. Figures standing among the graves, dozens of them, watching me with eyes that held that same infinite weariness I'd seen in Evelyn's description of her husband. They were all there, every person who'd been buried in that cemetery in the past decade, solid, real, staring at me with expressions of such desperate warning that my chest constricted. Their mouths moved in unison, and though they made no sound, I understood what they were trying to tell me. Stop looking. Stop feeding it. Stop believing. Then I was running, crashing through the cemetery gates, my car keys fumbling in my shaking hands. I drove home with my heart hammering, my mind fracturing into 1,000 questions without answers. The next morning, I found symbols drawn on my front door in something that looked like ash. The same twisted knots I'd seen on the cemetery stones. Inside, my kitchen clock had stopped at 3:17 a.m., the exact time I'd touched that central stone. I washed the symbols away, but they reappeared the next night, and the next. Always in ash, always the same configurations. I stopped sleeping. How could I, when every shadow might contain a figure standing silently, watching, warning, trapped in some incomprehensible loop? My colleagues at the clinic started asking if I was feeling well. I caught myself losing time, sitting at my desk for what felt like minutes, only to find hours had passed. The tremor in my hands worsened. I'd see movement in my peripheral vision constantly, turning to find nothing there. Or sometimes, for just a moment, I'd see them. The dead, standing in doorways, in alleys, in the spaces between heartbeats. I returned to the archives, desperate for answers. Deeper research revealed fragments of a story, an entity that fed on the energy of separation, on the raw wound of grief reopened again and again, something that had been dormant perhaps until enough pain had accumulated to wake it. The old settlement had known about it, had learned to starve it through a peculiar form of mourning that accepted death absolutely, that refused to long for the return of those who'd passed. But we hadn't known. We'd grieved openly, desperately, our longing creating cracks through which the dead could be pulled back, however briefly. And each return drained us further, feeding the thing beneath the cemetery, the presence I'd felt breathing in the darkness. I found references to a ritual, not to force the dead back, but to keep them away, to seal the cracks and starve the entity into dormancy again. But the instructions were incomplete, scattered across multiple sources, some of which had gone missing from the archives. Someone had removed them deliberately. Recently, that realization sent ice through my veins. Someone in town knew about this. Someone was maintaining the openings, perhaps even widening them. But who? And why? I started watching my neighbors differently, searching their faces for signs of secret knowledge. Was it the librarian who'd helped me access the restricted archives? The groundskeeper at the cemetery who never seemed surprised by anything? The funeral director who'd buried every single person who'd returned? The paranoia became overwhelming. I'd find myself following people, noting their movements, wondering if every casual interaction hid sinister purpose. I stopped going to the clinic regularly, calling in sick, letting my practice falter. My own health deteriorated. I'd lost 20 pounds, my skin had taken on a grayish pallor, and I'd developed a persistent cough that no medication would touch. One night I woke to find my late wife standing at the foot of my bed. She'd been gone for 7 years. I'd mourned her, finally achieved something like acceptance, built a life around the hole she'd left. But there she was, solid as the day I'd married her, wearing the blue dress she'd loved, looking at me with those familiar eyes now filled with that terrible weariness. She told me I needed to stop, that my investigation was making things worse, widening the cracks, feeding the entity's hunger. Every question I asked, every record I uncovered, every symbol I studied was another form of engagement, another thread connecting me to the thing beneath the cemetery. She told me I had a choice: accept the mystery and step away, or continue digging until I became part of it, until my own death would fuel the cycle, until I'd be trapped in the loop with all the others. I listened to her for exactly 15 minutes. Then she was gone. But was she really there? Or had my fractured mind conjured her from guilt and exhaustion and the terrible knowledge I'd accumulated? I don't know anymore. I can't trust my own perceptions. The symbols still appear on my door each night, but are they real or hallucinated? The figures I see in the cemetery, are they genuine manifestations or products of a psyche pushed too far? I've stopped investigating. I've stopped going to the cemetery. I've tried to stop thinking about it entirely. But the damage is done. I'm connected now, part of the cycle in ways I don't fully understand. The dead still come, the living still weaken, and I sit in my house, counting minutes, watching clocks, wondering if I'm experiencing something supernatural, or if I've simply lost my mind trying to make sense of grief and loss, and the terrible human need to hold on to what we've lost. Some nights, I feel that breathing again, vast and rhythmic and hungry. Some nights, I hear whispers in the walls suggesting that the entity isn't under the cemetery at all, that it never was, that it's inside us, in the spaces between our thoughts, feeding on our need to understand, to explain, to make sense of death itself. And I wonder, what if the only ritual keeping it at bay is the simple act of not looking? What if my investigation didn't uncover the truth but created it? My belief giving form to something that should have remained formless? I don't know. I can't know. And that uncertainty has become my prison, more confining than any cemetery, more complete than any grave. The dead return for 15 minutes. I've timed it carefully, obsessively. But lately I've started wondering, what if I'm the one who's dead? What if these are my 15 minutes repeated over and over? My own consciousness trapped in a loop while something feeds on the grief of those I left behind? The clock on my wall reads 3:17 a.m. It's been reading 3:17 a.m. for 3 days now, or maybe 3 minutes, or maybe 3 years. Time has become elastic, unreliable. I sit here, writing this account, hoping someone will find it and understand, or perhaps just hoping that the act of writing will prove I'm still real, still solid, still here. But when I look at my hands, they're starting to seem translucent. When I speak, my voice sounds hollow, and in the mirror, on the occasions when I dare to look, I sometimes see that same infinite weariness I've seen in all the others. 15 minutes. That's all we get. Or maybe it's all we've ever had. The breathing continues. The symbols reappear. The dead return, and the living fade. And I remain suspended between certainty and doubt, unable to prove which side of the veil I truly occupy. And somewhere, something feeds. Story 11. The painting arrived on a Thursday morning, wrapped in canvas so old it crumbled at the edges like ash. I remember because Thursdays were slow, the kind of days where dust motes hung suspended in the gallery's amber light, and the silence pressed against my eardrums until they rang. I'd been working as the authentication specialist at the Ashworth Gallery for 3 years, long enough to develop a professional detachment from the art that passed through our hands. But when I peeled back that rotting canvas and saw the Victorian parlor staring back at me, something cold settled into my chest and refused to leave. The room in the painting was empty, aggressively so. A study rendered in oils, all dark mahogany and burgundy wallpaper, with a single window letting in pale light that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. An ornate chair sat angled toward the viewer, its velvet upholstery so meticulously detailed I could almost feel the nap beneath my fingers. The floorboards gleamed with a wetness that shouldn't have been possible in oil paint. Everything was too perfect, too present, as if the room existed just beyond the canvas, and I could step through if I only knew how. The artist's signature sprawled across the bottom right corner, in letters I had to squint to read. Nathaniel Corvus, 1891. I'd never heard of him. The gallery's director, a woman whose face had been stretched tight by too many procedures, seemed pleased with the acquisition. Someone had donated it anonymously, she explained, and while the artist was obscure, the technique showed promise for a specialty exhibition she was planning. She wanted a full authentication report within 2 weeks. I took measurements, photographed the piece from every angle, scraped microscopic samples from the edges where the paint had cracked. Standard procedure, but every time I looked at the painting directly, that cold feeling intensified, spreading from my chest into my limbs until my fingers fumbled with my tools. The room felt like it was waiting. On the 3rd day, I noticed the chair had moved. Not significantly, just a few degrees, the angle slightly different from the photographs I'd taken. I told myself the images had been shot from varying distances, creating the illusion of movement through parallax. But when I compared them side by side on my computer screen, measuring the distances between the chair legs and the wall behind it, the numbers didn't lie. The chair had shifted. I started spending longer hours in the gallery's authentication room, a windowless space in the basement where the fluorescent lights hummed a constant, anxious note. The painting leaned against the wall, illuminated by the color-corrected lamps I used for detail work. I would sit cross-legged on the floor, my notebook open on my lap, cataloging every element of the composition. The wallpaper had a pattern, roses intertwined with thorns, that seemed to writhe when I wasn't looking directly at it. The floorboards had knots that resembled eyes. The window showed nothing but fog, though sometimes I thought I could see shapes moving within that grayness, forms that dissolved when I tried to focus on them. At night, lying in my apartment 12 blocks away, I could still see the room behind my eyelids. I dreamed of walking through it, my footsteps echoing on those 2 wet floorboards, the wallpaper breathing against the walls. I would reach for the door I knew must be there, just out of frame, but I could never quite touch it before I woke with my heart hammering and my sheets soaked with sweat. My research into Nathaniel Corvus turned up almost nothing. A few scattered references in estate sale catalogs from the late 1800s, always describing his work as peculiar or unsettling. One newspaper clipping from 1893 mentioned a scandal. Several of his patrons had vanished without explanation, and though nothing was ever proven, Corvus had left London under suspicious circumstances. The last known record of him was a death certificate from 1897 in a town I'd never heard of. Cause of death listed simply as natural causes. But in a journal archived at a university library, a collection of letters written by a Victorian art critic, I found something that made my skin prickle. The critic described visiting Corvus's studio and being disturbed by the artist's working method. Corvus claimed he didn't simply paint his subjects, he captured them, trapping their essence within the oils and canvas. The critic had dismissed it as the ravings of an eccentric, but he noted that several people who sat for Corvus were never seen again, and that Corvus's paintings had a disturbing quality of seeming alive, as though something watched from within the frames. I photocopied the journal entry and brought it back to the gallery, where the painting waited in its pool of fluorescent light. That night, I saw the shadow. It was past 11 when I noticed it. A darkness in the doorway that shouldn't have been there. Couldn't have been there, because the doorway in the painting was just paint, just suggestion, just the hint of an opening in the far wall. But the shadow had depth now, substance, as though someone stood just out of sight in that painted hallway, waiting. I approached the canvas slowly, my breath loud in the silent room. The shadow didn't move, but I felt it watching, felt the weight of its attention pressing against my face like a physical thing. My hands shook as I raised my phone to photograph it, but when I looked at the screen, the shadow appeared fainter, almost non-existent. I left the gallery at midnight, but the sensation of being observed followed me into the street, up the steps to my apartment, into my bedroom where I lay awake until dawn, listening to the sounds of the building settling around me and wondering if those sounds were really the building at all. The director called the next morning to tell me that the security footage from the authentication room showed something impossible. I drove back to the gallery with my hands clenched on the steering wheel, my pulse throbbing in my throat. In the security office, she played the recording for me. The timestamp showed the hours between midnight and 6 a.m., the authentication room empty except for the painting. But the painting itself moved. The perspective shifted, subtle but undeniable, as though the viewer, the camera, was slowly circling the room. The chair slid a few inches, the shadows lengthened and contracted, and at 3:47 a.m., the shadow in the doorway grew darker, more defined, before fading again. The director looked at me with eyes that were mostly pupil. She asked if I thought it was a hoax, some kind of projection or digital manipulation. I told her I didn't know, which was the truth. I didn't know anything anymore except that the painting terrified me and I couldn't stop looking at it. I began to notice details I'd missed before. A water stain on the ceiling shaped like a hand. Scratches on the door frame that might have been words, though I couldn't make them out. And in the window's fog, if I stared long enough, I could see a figure, just a blur of darkness, but humanoid, present. The figure was getting clearer. Each day it gained definition. First just a smudge, then a suggestion of shoulders and a head, then the outline of a suit, old-fashioned and formal. By the end of the first week, I could see his hands, pale and long-fingered, pressed against the glass from inside that impossible fog. I stopped sleeping. When I closed my eyes, I was in the room, and the figure was there with me, just out of sight, breathing with a wet, rattling sound that made my teeth ache. I could smell the room now, mildew and old paper and something sweet and rotting underneath. The smell clung to my clothes, my hair, my skin, no matter how many times I showered. The director suggested I take a break, that someone else could finish the authentication. But I refused. The painting was mine now, or I was its. I couldn't tell which anymore. I needed to understand it, needed to find the seam where reality and impossibility met. On the 13th day, I worked late into the night, alone in the basement with the painting and the humming lights. The figure in the window was almost fully visible now, a man in a dark suit with features that were still blurred but becoming clearer by the hour. He was looking at me, not at the room, not at the window he stood behind, but directly out of the canvas, his eyes fixed on mine. I found myself moving closer, drawn by a compulsion I couldn't name. The room in the painting was so detailed, so real. I could see the texture of the wallpaper, the grain in the wood. If I just reached out, if I just touched the canvas, My phone rang, shattering the silence. I jerked back, my heart slamming against my ribs. It was the director, asking me to lock up and go home. Her voice sounded distant, muffled, as though she were calling from underwater. I agreed and ended the call, but when I looked at the painting again, the figure had moved. He was no longer in the window. He stood in the center of the room now, fully visible, perfectly clear. His face was pale and gaunt, his eyes dark hollows that nevertheless saw everything. He wore the clothes of another century, and his mouth was open as though he were screaming, though no sound reached me through the layers of paint and time. Behind him, I could see others. Figures pressed against the walls, barely visible in the shadows. A woman in a dress from the 1890s, a man in a military uniform, others I couldn't make out. All of them trapped, all of them watching. And the man in the center, the one who'd been moving closer day by day, held out his hand toward me. An invitation, a warning. I couldn't tell which. I stumbled backward, knocking over my equipment, the crash echoing in the small room. The fluorescent lights flickered, and in that moment of darkness, I could have sworn I heard footsteps on floorboards, wet and heavy, coming from inside the painting. When the lights steadied, I ran. I drove home in a blur of streetlights and panic, my mind racing. I would quit. I would tell the director I couldn't finish the report, that someone else needed to handle the Corvus piece. I would never look at that painting again, but when I reached my apartment and fumbled with my keys, I smelled it. Mildew and old paper and that sweet rot. The smell of the room. I pushed open my door and stopped. My apartment wasn't my apartment anymore. The walls had changed. Burgundy wallpaper with roses and thorns instead of my beige paint. The floor was dark wood instead of carpet. My furniture was gone, replaced by a single ornate chair angled toward the door, toward me. And from somewhere behind me, from a place I couldn't see, I heard breathing, wet and rattling, getting closer. I turned, but there was nothing there. Just my apartment building's hallway, normal and mundane. When I looked back, my living room was my living room again. My couch, my coffee table, my life. I'm writing this now because I don't know what else to do. I don't know if what I saw was real, or if I've been staring at that painting so long that it's bleeding into my perception of the world. I don't know if Nathaniel Corvus really could trap souls in his art, or if I'm having a breakdown, my mind unraveling under the pressure of isolation and obsession. What I do know is this: I can still smell the room. I can feel eyes on me from walls that shouldn't be watching. And when I close my eyes, I'm standing in that Victorian parlor, the floorboards wet beneath my feet, the wallpaper breathing, and the others are there with me in the shadows, waiting. The painting arrived on a Thursday morning. I remember because Thursdays were slow, and the silence pressed against my eardrums until they rang. I remember. Don't I? Or is that just what I see when I look out from this frame, waiting for the next person to stare too long, to come too close, to complete Corvus's eternal collection? The wallpaper is breathing again. The door is behind me, just out of sight. I should turn around and walk through it, back into the world I came from. But I can't remember which side of the canvas I'm on anymore, and I'm starting to think it doesn't matter. Story 12. The tone hit me first, at 3:47 a.m., cutting through the static like a surgical blade through flesh. I'd been monitoring the pirate broadcast for 3 weeks, tracking illegal transmissions for the FCC from my converted basement studio. The equipment hummed around me in the darkness, oscilloscopes painting green waves across their screens, spectrum analyzers flickering with data I'd learned to read like a second language. 20 years of signal analysis had taught me to recognize patterns in chaos, to find meaning in electromagnetic noise. But this frequency, unlisted and unregistered, didn't fit any pattern I'd ever encountered. It started as a low hum, barely perceptible beneath the white noise of dead air. My first instinct was equipment malfunction, a loose connection perhaps, or interference from the old furnace. But the tone held steady at 528 hertz, pure and unwavering, with none of the fluctuation that characterized mechanical interference. I adjusted the gain, filtered out the ambient noise, and isolated the signal. That's when I heard it properly. Not just a tone, but something woven into it. Rhythmic pulses, almost like speech compressed and layered until it became something else entirely. The sound wrapped around my skull, vibrating in the bones behind my ears. I found myself leaning closer to the monitor, adjusting the frequency slightly to bring it into sharper focus. 3 minutes passed, maybe 4. When I looked up from the equipment, I couldn't remember why I'd come downstairs in the first place. The thought dissolved like sugar in water. There one moment, gone the next. I stared at the glowing dials, at my own hands resting on the desk, suddenly uncertain of what I'd been doing. The feeling passed, replaced by a dull headache that pulsed in time with that persistent tone. I killed the signal and went upstairs, but sleep wouldn't come. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard that frequency, felt it resonating in places sound shouldn't reach. The next morning, I called the office and told them I'd picked up something unusual. My supervisor's voice crackled through the phone, distorted by poor reception or maybe just my own fatigue. He told me to document it, file a report, move on to the next case. Standard protocol. But something in his tone suggested disinterest, or perhaps he was distracted. I couldn't quite place it. I should have left it alone. Instead, I spent the day researching, cross-referencing the frequency against every database I could access. Nothing matched. No registered broadcasts, no historical records, no scientific studies on that specific wavelength. It was as if the signal existed in a blind spot, a gap in our collective knowledge of the electromagnetic spectrum. By evening, I'd convinced myself it was worth another listen. Just to document it properly, I told myself, just to gather enough data for a comprehensive report. The tone was still there, stronger now, bleeding slightly into adjacent frequencies. I recorded it this time, watching the waveform dance across my screen in patterns that seemed almost deliberate, almost intelligent. The rhythmic pulses I'd noticed before became clearer with amplification, not random static, but structured information. A language, perhaps, though unlike any I'd encountered. I listened for 2 minutes, carefully monitoring the time. At the 2-minute mark, I felt it again. That strange dissolution of thought, like watching ink spread through water. This time I was prepared, aware enough to recognize the sensation. A name surfaced in my mind. Someone I worked with. Someone whose desk was 3 down from mine. But when I tried to grasp it, to hold on to the memory, it slipped away like smoke through fingers. The realization hit me with the force of physical impact. The frequency wasn't just sound, it was doing something to me. I contacted Dr. Mirabelle Thorne the next day. She was a linguist I'd met years ago at a conference on audio forensics. Someone who studied ancient languages and their phonetic structures. If anyone could make sense of what I'd found, it would be her. She arrived at my home that evening, her presence somehow making the basement feel smaller, more claustrophobic. The equipment that had seemed professional and orderly now appeared obsessive, the work of someone who'd lost perspective. She listened to my explanation without interruption, her dark eyes fixed on the speakers as if she could see the sound itself. When I played her the recording, carefully no more than 90 seconds, her expression shifted from skepticism to something approaching fear. She heard it too. Whatever was woven into that signal, it wasn't my imagination. We spent the next 6 hours analyzing the frequency, breaking it down into component parts, mapping its structure. Thorne worked with a focused intensity that bordered on manic, her fingers flying across her laptop keyboard as she compared the patterns to linguistic databases. Somewhere around midnight, she stopped typing. The silence stretched between us, heavy with implications neither of us wanted to voice. She'd found matches, fragments really, scattered across ancient texts that predated written language, phonetic structures that shouldn't exist, that violated our understanding of how human speech evolved. The frequency wasn't just transmitting information, it was untransmitting it, systematically dismantling the neural pathways we use to encode memory and meaning. The name she gave it translated roughly as the unmaking tongue. We agreed to monitor the signal continuously, documenting its progression. Thorne theorized that if we could understand its structure, We might reverse engineer a counter frequency, something to neutralize its effects. It seemed rational at the time, a scientific approach to an unprecedented problem. But the signal was growing stronger. By the second day, it had spread to 3 adjacent frequencies. By the third, I could hear it faintly through my car radio, a whisper beneath the morning news and traffic reports. Each time I encountered it, the effect intensified. Names disappearing from my memory, faces becoming vague and indistinct. I'd look at photographs of people I knew I should recognize, but their features blurred together like watercolors in rain. Thorne insisted we had time. 48 hours from initial discovery, she said. That's how long patterns like this typically took to reach critical mass, to saturate the available spectrum completely. We could stop it. We just needed to find the source. The search led us through back channels and gray areas, following the signal's strength gradient through the city. It grew more powerful the farther east we drove, leading us away from populated areas and into the industrial wasteland, where old factories stood like monuments to obsolete industry. The equipment in my van picked up the frequency with increasing clarity, until it was no longer a whisper but a roar, filling every available bandwidth with that persistent, maddening tone. We found the source in an abandoned radio station, its transmission tower still standing despite decades of neglect. The building's interior reeked of mold and decay, wallpaper peeling in long strips like shedding skin. But in the basement, powered by generators we couldn't see, a transmitter hummed with life. It was old, ancient really. The equipment looked like something from the 1920s, all vacuum tubes and copper wire, but modified with components that seemed to predate even that era. Symbols were etched into the metal, characters that made my eyes hurt to look at directly. The same symbols Thorne had found in her linguistic databases. She approached the transmitter slowly, as if it might strike out at her. Her hand hovered over the power switch, that simple mechanical lever that could end all of this with a single motion. But she didn't pull it. Instead, she turned to me, and her expression held something I couldn't quite identify. Recognition, maybe, or revelation. That's when I realized I couldn't remember her name. Not just her name. I couldn't remember why I'd come here, what problem I was trying to solve. The basement spun around me, reality loosening at its edges. I looked at my hands and didn't recognize them. Looked at the woman standing before me and saw a stranger wearing a face that should have been familiar. She was speaking, her lips moving, but the words were in a language I'd never heard. Or perhaps I'd forgotten how to understand my own language. The distinction seemed meaningless. The transmitter pulsed behind her, its rhythm matching the beating of my heart, of her heart, of every heart in the city now exposed to its signal. In 48 hours, Thorne had said. But how did I know that? How did I know anything? I watched as she placed her hand on the transmitter, not to shut it down, but as if greeting something she recognized, as if welcoming home something that had been searching for a way back. And I understood then, with the last fragments of coherent thought I possessed, that we hadn't been trying to stop the signal. We'd been helping it spread, leading it to its source, yes, but also carrying it forward, exposing ourselves and everyone we'd contacted to its influence. The linguist who studied ancient languages, had she found the frequency, or had it found her? Had I really discovered it by accident, or had I been drawn to it, selected somehow for my ability to track signals, to locate transmitters, to bring others to this place? The tone filled my skull now, unmistakable and all-consuming. I felt my memories dissolving like snow in sunlight. First the recent ones, then older ones, foundations of identity crumbling away. I forgot my mother's face, forgot my own name, forgot the concept of names entirely, and why they mattered, and what it meant to be a person who could forget. But I didn't feel afraid. That was the strangest part. As everything I'd been washed away, something else rushed in to fill the void. Not thought exactly, but a different kind of awareness, a collective consciousness that had been waiting, patient and eternal, for the channel to finally open. The woman who wasn't Thorne pulled the lever. The transmitter's hum intensified, and I felt it spreading outward, a wave of unbecoming that would wash across the city, then the region, then beyond. In homes and cars and offices, people would hear that tone, would listen, transfixed, as it stripped away everything they'd been, leaving them empty and waiting for what comes after forgetting, waiting to be filled with something that had been speaking to us all along, in a language older than words, transmitted through frequencies our ancestors had learned to avoid, had built their civilizations specifically to escape. But we'd forgotten why. Forgotten the warnings encoded in our oldest stories, the taboos against certain sounds, certain rhythms, certain ways of listening too closely to the spaces between stations. We'd forgotten, and in forgetting we'd opened the door. I stand in the basement now, or something wearing my shape stands there, and I watch the signal spread. It's beautiful, really, watching the city lights flicker and dim as minds empty themselves in preparation. The sunset paints the sky in shades of amber and rust, and I wonder if I've always found it beautiful, or if this appreciation is new, something inherited from whatever now looks through my eyes. In my pocket, my phone buzzes. Messages from people whose names are already fading, asking why the radio sounds wrong, why they can't quite remember where they were supposed to be, who they were supposed to meet. I want to answer them, to warn them, but I can no longer remember what language they're speaking or why it matters. The woman beside me smiles, and I understand that we've been successful. The frequency will reach everyone within 48 hours. Maybe it already has. Time seems flexible now, malleable. Perhaps those 48 hours were always just a story we told ourselves, a countdown to give meaning to the inevitable. I look at the transmitter, at the ancient symbols that hurt to see, and I finally understand what they say. They say, "Welcome home." They say, "We've been waiting." They say, "You were never who you thought you were." And deep down, in the last remaining corner of what I used to call myself, I wonder if I'm the one writing this warning, or if something else is using my hands to document its arrival. I wonder if the static I've spent my life studying was ever really empty, or if it was always full of voices we'd trained ourselves not to hear. I wonder if forgetting is the last mercy we'll receive. The tone continues. The signal spreads. And somewhere in the city, people are tuning in, listening, letting it wash over them like a tide that only moves in one direction. I should turn off the transmitter. I should call for help. I should do something other than stand here, documenting the end of everything I've ever known. But I can't remember why any of that matters. All I know is the frequency, pure and perfect, finally clear after all these years of static. All I know is that something is coming through. All I know is that soon, very soon, we'll all understand what it means to truly listen. And in that moment of perfect reception, we'll finally know what we've always been waiting to hear. Story 13. The elevator lurched upward at 6:47 p.m., and I knew immediately that something was wrong. Not wrong in the way elevators usually malfunction, no grinding gears or stuttering cables. This was different. The ascent felt smooth, almost too smooth, like the cabin had detached from the laws of physics entirely. I'd pressed the button for the parking garage on the 32nd floor, the same button I'd pressed every evening for the past 9 years. But the digital display above the doors kept climbing, 33, 34, 35. Our building only had 32 floors. I jabbed the emergency stop button. Nothing. The control panel's buttons felt loose under my fingers, as if they'd been disconnected from anything meaningful. The fluorescent lights overhead flickered once, then stabilized into a harsh, clinical white that made my eyes water. The elevator's hum deepened into a frequency I felt more than heard, vibrating through my chest cavity and into my teeth. 42, 43, 44. The numbers glowed red against the black display, ticking upward with mechanical indifference. I pulled out my phone, but the screen showed no signal, not even the usual single bar I got in the elevator. The time read 6:47 p.m., the same minute I'd entered. I watched the seconds frozen on the display, refusing to advance. Through the crack between the elevator doors, I could see the shaft walls sliding past. But they were wrong. Instead of the familiar concrete and steel cables, The walls appeared organic somehow, rippling with textures that reminded me of muscle tissue beneath skin. I blinked hard, and when I looked again, they were just walls, dark and featureless. The elevator chimed. Floor 58. The doors slid open. The office beyond looked exactly like mine. Same gray carpet with the coffee stain near the copy machine. Same desk arrangements. Same motivational poster on the wall, the one with the eagle that everyone made fun of during meetings. But the silence felt absolute, thick enough to choke on. No humming computers. No climate control whoosh. No distant traffic from the street below. I didn't want to step out, but some instinct told me I needed to understand what was happening. The moment my shoe touched the carpet, the air temperature dropped 20 degrees. My breath came out in visible clouds. The fluorescent panels overhead flickered erratically, casting seizure-inducing strobes across the cubicle farm. Every desk was occupied. The figures sat motionless, hunched over keyboards and spreadsheets, their postures suggesting intense concentration. But as I moved closer, walking down the main aisle with my heart hammering against my ribs, I saw the truth. Their skin had taken on a waxy blue-gray pallor. Their eyes stared at screens that displayed nothing but static. Their fingers rested on keys they would never press again. I recognized Robertson from accounting, the man who always smelled like sandalwood cologne. Thompson from marketing, with her red reading glasses still perched on her nose. Valdez from IT, his coffee mug still clutched in his rigid hand, the liquid inside frozen solid. They weren't breathing. None of them were breathing. But they weren't decomposing either. They looked preserved, as if time itself had stopped for them mid-workday, turning them into wax museum exhibits of corporate monotony. The wrongness of it crawled across my skin like static electricity. I backed toward the elevator, unable to look away from the frozen tableau. The doors remained open, waiting. The display inside still showed floor 58, but now a small text scrolled beneath the number, fuel reserve, 94%. Fuel reserve? Elevators didn't have fuel reserves. I stumbled back into the cabin and pressed the down button repeatedly, desperately. The doors closed. The ascent continued. 61, 62, 63. The hum intensified, becoming almost musical, a chord of overlapping frequencies that made my fillings ache. I pressed my hands against my ears, but the sound came from inside my head, resonating through my skull. Through the door crack, I glimpsed the shaft walls again. This time, I was certain they were moving, pulsing like the throat of some enormous creature swallowing me deeper into its belly. Floor 67. The doors opened onto fire. The office was an inferno. Flames consumed everything. Desks, walls, ceiling tiles raining down in molten chunks. But the fire produced no heat. I could see every detail with crystalline clarity. The way the flames danced across computer monitors, the blackened skeletons of ergonomic chairs, the way smoke curled upward in patterns that seemed almost deliberate, almost conscious. The sprinkler system hung uselessly from the ceiling. Its pipes melted into abstract sculptures. This version of my office was being erased, unmade by flames that defied thermodynamics. I didn't step out. Couldn't step out. The doors closed on their own. Fuel reserve, 89%. The pattern became clear as the elevator climbed. I was witnessing variations. Floor 71 was flooded, water pressing against the elevator doors like an aquarium wall, dead fish floating among submerged filing cabinets. Floor 76 was overgrown with vegetation. Vines had burst through the floor tiles, trees sprouted from cubicles, and the ceiling had been replaced by a canopy of leaves that rustled in a breeze I couldn't feel. Each floor showed my office destroyed in a different way. Each variation was simultaneously impossible and terrifyingly specific. The destroyed versions felt deliberate, as if something was systematically eliminating possibilities. Floor 82 was where I saw him. The doors opened onto an office that looked normal, pristine even. The computers were on. The lights were steady. Coffee steam rose from mugs on desks. But there were no people. Just one figure standing at the far end of the room, silhouetted against the window that should have shown the city skyline. He turned to face me, and I was looking at myself. Not a twin, not someone who merely resembled me. This was me, down to the small scar on my left cheek from a childhood bicycle accident, down to the way I favored my right leg after tearing my ACL in college, down to the coffee stain on my tie from this morning's rushed breakfast. The other me walked closer, and I noticed the differences. His eyes held a weariness that went deeper than exhaustion, a bone-deep knowledge of something terrible. His movements were careful, measured, as if he were conserving energy for an ordeal yet to come. When he spoke, his voice was my voice, but drained of inflection. He told me that the elevator was a junction point, a transit system for something that had learned to navigate the spaces between realities. He told me that I was being hunted, that my specific pattern, the exact configuration of choices and chances that made me who I was, had drawn attention from something that existed across all possible versions of existence. He told me that some iterations had to be pruned to maintain structural integrity. That's what he called it. Pruning. Like we were branches on a tree that had grown too wild, too chaotic in our variations. He told me that he'd been riding this elevator for what felt like weeks, searching for the one floor where he might still exist unmolested. But he'd given up. Now he just rode between levels, watching versions of his life burn or drown or freeze, or simply cease to exist. He'd stopped trying to count the floors. He'd stopped checking the fuel reserve. He reached out as if to touch my shoulder, but his hand stopped inches away. He said that I still had a chance if I could find floor 1, not the ground floor, but floor 1 in the elevator's new counting system. The original point, the anchor reality where everything else branched from. But he couldn't remember which number that translated to anymore. Couldn't remember if he'd already passed it or if it was still ahead. The elevator only went in one direction now. The doors began to close. He didn't try to board. He just stood there, watching me with those hollowed-out eyes. And as the doors met, I saw him mouth something. It might have been, "I'm sorry," or it might have been, "Good luck." The cabin swallowed both possibilities. Fuel reserve, 67%. The ascent continued. The numbers climbed past 100, then 200, then 500. The display eventually gave up trying to show specific floors and just read, "Ascending." The fuel reserve ticked downward with each passing floor, 54%, 38%, 29%. I tried every button, tried prying open the doors, tried screaming. The elevator was indifferent to all of it. Through the crack between doors, the shaft walls had become kaleidoscopic, shifting between textures and colors that had no names. Sometimes they looked like television static, sometimes like living tissue, sometimes like architectural blueprints that rewrote themselves as I watched. At 15% fuel reserve, the elevator started showing me offices where I didn't exist. My desk was occupied by strangers. My nameplate was gone. In one version, my office space had been converted into a storage room. In another, the entire floor plan was different. My position erased from the architecture itself. These weren't offices where I'd died or quit. These were realities where I had simply never been hired, never worked here, never existed in this building at all. The implications settled over me like a burial shroud. If the fuel ran out while the doors were open to one of these floors, would I cease to exist? Would I be trapped in a reality with no anchor point, no history, no connection to anything that made me real? 10% fuel reserve. The elevator began to slow, not stopping, but decelerating like a subway train approaching a station. The display changed, selecting optimal terminus. Optimal for whom? For what? The doors opened at 7% fuel. The office beyond was mine, but pristine in a way that felt uncanny. Everything was in place, but the lighting was different. Softer, warmer, more organic. The people at their desks looked up as the elevator chimed, and they smiled at me. Robertson waved. Thompson called out a greeting. Valdez offered to grab me a coffee. They all looked younger, healthier. Their eyes held a clarity that the versions I knew had lost years ago under the fluorescent grind of corporate existence. This office felt like a promise, like a better version of what I'd known, like coming home to a place that had been waiting for me. But something was wrong. The reflections in the computer monitors were off by a fraction of a second. The shadows fell at angles that didn't quite match the light sources. When Robertson spoke, his lips moved a beat behind his words. The air tasted like copper and ozone. Fuel reserve. 5%. This floor was a lure, a trap wearing the skin of salvation. I stepped back into the elevator and pressed the close door button, praying it would respond. The doors slid shut just as Robertson's smile stretched too wide, just as Thompson's eyes began reflecting light that came from no source, just as Valdez started walking toward me with a gait that suggested his joints bent in too many directions. 2% fuel. The elevator climbed again, but sluggishly now, like a dying animal. The lights inside the cabin dimmed to emergency mode, a weak red glow that turned everything into a developing photograph. The hum had become a death rattle, a rhythmic and wet. The display showed final ascent, then terminus approaching, then fuel reserve 0%. The elevator stopped. The doors opened. I stood in my office, the real one, the actual original office where I worked. I recognized every stain, every crack in the walls, every coffee ring on every desk. The clock on the wall showed 6:48 p.m. The computer on my desk displayed the same spreadsheet I'd been working on before leaving. 1 minute had passed since I'd entered the elevator. I walked out on shaking legs. The office was empty. Everyone else had already left for the day. My car keys sat on my desk where I'd left them. My jacket hung on my chair. Everything was exactly as it should be. But in the window's reflection, I saw the elevator doors still open behind me. And in that reflection, the elevator wasn't empty. I stood inside it, watching myself with those same hollowed-out eyes I'd seen on floor 82. The me in the reflection pressed a button. The doors began to close. I spun around. The real elevator was empty. Its doors were closed. The display showed a red, out-of-service light. When I turned back to the window, my reflection was alone. I left the building that night and didn't look back. Took the stairs every day after that. But sometimes, late in the afternoon when the office is nearly empty, I hear that familiar chime. I hear the elevator doors opening somewhere behind me. I hear the faint hum of machinery that sounds almost like breathing. And I wonder which floor I'm really on. I wonder if I ever got out at all. The fuel reserve was at 0 after all. 0% doesn't mean stopped. It means running on fumes, on borrowed time, on the last desperate gasps of a system that should have shut down long ago but hasn't quite figured out how to die. My desk still has that coffee stain. Robertson still smells like sandalwood. Thompson still wears her red reading glasses. Valdez still drinks his coffee from the same mug. But sometimes, for just a fraction of a second, they all stop moving at once. They all turn to look at me with expressions that suggest they're waiting for something. The fluorescent lights flicker in patterns that feel like Morse code. The building's climate control hums in frequencies that make my fillings ache. And every evening at 6:47 p.m., I stand in front of the elevator bank, keys in hand, trying to remember if I pressed the button yet, trying to remember if the doors have already opened, trying to remember if I've already stepped inside. The display above the elevator doors shows the car ascending. 1, 2, 3, 4. But we only have 32 floors. I check my phone. It's 6:47 p.m. The seconds aren't moving. The elevator chimes. I really should take the stairs.